Night on the Giza Plateau begins with a breath. Heat loosens its grip, and the day's glare retreats into a long sigh that leaves the limestone cool to the touch. Wind slips between the blocks with the hush of a library after closing. If you've ever stood in a desert after sunset, you know how quickly time seems to change gears. The light goes thin and blue, the sounds grow close and private, and every footstep feels like a trespass. Under the thin crust of sand, beneath crusted shells of fossil limestone older than human memory, a story waits that does not rush to meet us. We have been told for generations exactly how this story begins. Around 45 centuries ago, kings whose names still brighten museum labels marshaled a workforce and raised geometry into mountains. Their cartouches are still carved in places you can point to. The dates line up neatly with lists and ledgers. The narrative is a clean staircase: farming, towns, writing, kings, pyramids. That version is comforting because it behaves. It fits on placards. It makes sense at a glance. But tilt your head a little, and the picture wobbles. What if the polished ending we love to quote is only the last chapter of something older, far older, whose first pages we haven't found? What if these monumental shapes were already ancient when the earliest scribes were still learning which bird to draw for which sound? You know the familiar image: men in white linen skirts, copper tools flashing, sledges grinding along prepared paths while overseers call the rhythm. Now make a few adjustments. Lower the temperature a touch. Widen the river until it lounges into shallows and backwaters. Salt the horizon with patches of green, shrubs and grasses holding the dust in place. Imagine clouds that do more than hang as decoration. Far to the north, ice sheets the size of countries still brood across continents. It is not quite the Egypt in the schoolroom map, the one bleached by certainty into a single color. Call it Egypt before Egypt, a landscape in rehearsal for the world we recognize. Walk the plateau in that earlier dusk and you might hear frogs in temporary pools, smell damp stone after a burst of rain, watch the river make and unmake banks with a confidence it has since forgotten. This is speculation, yes, but it is not fantasy. Climates shift. Rivers change their minds. Deserts are not a permanent verdict, they are a phase. When you look closely here, the stone itself seems to remember water in a way our narratives sometimes do not. And once you notice that memory, you start to feel a tug at the edges of the timeline we've laid so carefully on top of the rock. People have, in recent decades, pointed out those tugging threads. Some focus on the way certain walls around the great guardian of the plateau look as if they've been worked by something more complicated than wind. Others point to blocks nearby whose wear and rounded edges don't sit comfortably with 4.5 millennia of dryness. None of these observations, alone, overturns the textbook story. That's not how serious history works. But together they create a murmur, a suggestion that the ending we cherish may be less a beginning than a restoration, a claiming, a continuation. They propose a world where a later king could place his name upon older stone with the same right we place our bookmarks in old books, not as authors, but as readers who refuse to lose our place. The mind likes neatness. Our calendars march row by row like soldiers on parade. We prize smooth narrative skin. But the past is bumpy. It resists a straight edge. Push your fingers into the blocks at the Great Pyramid's base and you don't feel perfection, you feel surviving precision under weather and sand and the touch of a million hands. Those blocks were old by Homer's time. They have seen star patterns shift a fraction in the sky and men argue eternally about what those shifts mean. They have been rained on more than once, shaken, pried at, measured and remeasured by explorers and engineers and dreamers. They were patient when invading armies camped within sight of their shadows, and they were patient when the desert moved in, then out, then in again, the way a tide would if it had centuries to spend. It's easy to forget how much the desert hides. In another place not so far from here, archaeologists once pulled a complete ship out of the sand where no sea has rolled for an age, a vessel asleep in a trench like a folded thought. If wood can rest undisturbed for thousands of years under a lid of silt and dust, how many older structures, unfinished, repurposed, or entombed by a single unlucky shift in the river, might still be lying under this same discreet blanket? Stone is patient, but it is also sly. It wears the same face to many different years. Unless we catch it in the act, half quarried, half placed, and find a name nearby, we are left to read not pages but the pressure marks where pages used to be. That is the lure and the annoyance of this place. The material endures but the context frays, and where the context frays, imagination reaches for thread. You don't need to believe any single bold claim to feel the invitation of that possibility. You only need to grant that history's first draft was written in materials that do not last, reed and wood and breath. We are reading the second draft now, the stone draft, with whole paragraphs missing. In those blanks, some people draw chariots of gods, others sketch blueprints and lasers. Most of us simply wonder whether a few of our anchors are tied to the wrong posts. A greener Nile is not a miracle, it is a matter of orbit and wind. A rain-marked wall is not a revelation, it is a clue that must be weighed against other clues. But clues change the angle of the light. If you've only known Egypt through photographs and footage, the flattened sun, the beige smudge of heat, then you might think this land never did anything but dry. The plateau, with its tawny plains and deliberate geometry, feels like an argument against weather. Yet the scars on these stones mutter about conversations with water we didn't overhear. The Sphinx, whose profile you have seen so often it feels like a coin in the pocket of your mind, sits within an enclosure cut from bedrock whose walls ripple and groove in ways that point beyond sand alone. Those walls will get their turn later in our journey, when we place geology and epigraphy side by side on the table and see where they agree and where they argue. For now, it is enough to let the question linger at the threshold: what if the ground under the Pharaohs' story is older than the pharaohs themselves? There's an intoxication we get from certainty, a little shiver of control. Click a date into a timeline, connect it to a name, add a deed, and the mind relaxes. Museums, lectures, textbooks, these are our rituals for banishing chaos. But here, under the first stars, the rituals feel small, and the stone improves with silence. Stand at the base of the Great Pyramid and the city's neon blur becomes a far rumor. Your hands pick up powder from the blocks. You feel, unmistakably, that you are very late to a party that ended a long time ago, and the hosts cleaned up so well that they left only the furniture. That feeling isn't an argument. It has no footnotes. It simply asks you to keep two pictures in your head at once, the one where the Fourth Dynasty conceived, planned, and built almost everything we see, and the one where they arrived to find something older, weathered, half-buried, awe-inspiring, and chose to adopt it into their own story, to reface it, to repair it, to crown it with names. If you've made it this far, indulge one small ritual of our own. If you want more of this kind of slow, careful wondering, this walk between what is written and what is worn into stone, signal it. Tell me where you are listening from, and what the sky looks like where you are. The plateau is under my tongue as I speak, all chalk and dust and night air. I would like to imagine your air, too. And while you are thinking of it, let a simple thought drift across your mind like a thin cloud over a cold moon: the pyramids as survivors. Not singular triumphs at the start of a civilization, but durable inheritances, shapes inherited by kings who saw their chance to braid the old with the new and call the braid their own. You don't have to choose tonight. You don't have to trade your museum labels for mystery. Just let both possibilities sit in your lap without quarrel. Later, we will talk about rain and wind, about tool marks and shafts that look toward stars, about boats sleeping under sand and cities sleeping under water. For now, the wind is cooler, the stone is not. The Nile turns in the dark out of sight. The great triangles hold their posture like thought made visible. The night asks for nothing but attention. And in that, perhaps, is the first step toward a history big enough to keep its rough edges. Step down into the Sphinx enclosure and the air changes. It feels closer here, soundless in a way that makes your own breath loud. The walls rise on every side, limestone, stratified and scarred, bearing a skin of grooves that curl as they descend. Run your fingers across them and the stone yields a language without letters, long, vertical channels that look like the handwriting of water. This is where the debate sharpens from mood to method. The claim, First shouted into the wider world in the 1990s by Boston University geologist Robert Schoch, is simple enough to state and complicated to silence. These walls look like they were carved not only by wind and sand, but by years upon years of heavy rain. If that is so, then either the Sphinx is much older than the 4th dynasty, or the plateau has a climate memory we have not fully accounted for. At first pass, it sounds like one of those provocations that thrive on the internet because they are neat and naughty. But step back and watch how geologists actually read rock, and you'll see why the idea caught in the teeth of so many minds. Wind scours laterally. It abrades in sheets, rasping across faces and biting out ledges along softer bands. Its signature is a low, horizontal fretwork, sharp and directional, as if a blade were drawn one way again and again. Rain, especially in climates where it falls hard and often, writes differently. Water curls. It finds weaknesses and lingers. It cuts runnels that widen downward, softens corners, rounds steps, and leaves behind a surface that feels almost fluted, as if draped and then allowed to sag. Look again at the enclosure walls. The channels deepen toward the base, and the edges have that smoothed, melted look you get where water has played and played until angles give up. The counterargument is not glib, it is careful and grounded in years of fieldwork. Egyptologists point to the archaeological context that ties the Sphinx to the reign of Khafre, the way the statue sits within his pyramid complex, the causeway that binds it to the valley temple, the massive limestone blocks in that temple thought to have been quarried from the very pit in which the Sphinx rests. They add another layer, the geology of the plateau itself. The bedrock here isn't uniform, it's a sandwich of layers, some hard and resistant, others soft and crumbly. As softer strata weather and flake, harder ones protrude, producing relief that can mimic the rounded, pocketed shapes we associate with rainfall. Salt crystallization, driven by groundwater wicking upward and then evaporating in the heat, can exfoliate surfaces in ways that blur edges and hollow faces. In other words, wind, salt, and stone differences can, together, perform a convincing impersonation of rain. There is an older kind of evidence that resists both camps because it cares only for what breaks, repair. The Sphinx has been patched and cased more than once in antiquity. Blocks in its chest and paws bear the history of ancient maintenance, Old Kingdom, New Kingdom, later still, suggesting that even by those periods, weather had gnawed at the monument enough to demand attention. To some, that implies great age, to others, it simply confirms that an exposed limestone body, set low where runoff collects, is vulnerable no matter when you carve it. Stone keeps a ledger, it does not annotate intent. You can see, even within a single glance, how the two readings can live side by side inside the same wall. On a clear morning, with the sun throwing long shadows across the grooves, the enclosure feels like a frozen cascade. On a dusty noon, the horizontal ledging and the rough, grainy bite of sandware seem to shout just as loudly. Between these impressions runs the stubborn fact that makes arguments here so sticky: stone refuses our favorite dating tricks. Wood feeds radiocarbon. Bone does, too. Stone is nearly mute. Unless you find a tool abandoned mid-cut, a plaster skim you can sample, or a mortar fleck trapped in a seam, your timekeepers are all indirect. You can model exposure by measuring the tiny cosmogenic isotopes that build up when rock faces the sky. You can apply optically stimulated luminescence to the sand that once buried a surface. You can compare erosion rates across known spans and infer. But you do not get the crisp, carved in year 10, that epigraphers dream about. You get ranges and probabilities, drafts without dates. That is why this enclosure, so compact and self-contained, has become a field school for thinking itself. Schoch's rain reads the grooves as centuries of downpour from a greener age, potentially pushing the first carving of the Sphinx back toward the waning ice age or the opening millennia of the African humid period, when monsoon arms reached farther north and the Sahara wore lakes like mirrors. Egyptologists like Mark Lehner counter from the ground up: Khafre's quarries bite neatly into this pit, the valley temple's megaliths match the missing volumes, the arrangement makes dynastic sense. Other specialists split the difference. Some geologists, like Colin Reeder, have argued for substantial weathering in a time earlier than Kafr but still plausibly within Egypt's early dynastic arc, an age wet enough to worry limestone, not so remote as to require a lost civilization. In that space between much older and no older at all, the stones keep their poise, and we practice holding two truths: geology can speak without inscriptions, archaeology can narrate without rock behaving as we'd prefer. Step closer to the wall. The stripes and benches you see are not painted, they are the plateau's biography exposed. Harder beds, fossil-rich, cemented tight, stand proud. Softer beds crumble to powder under your thumb. Rain would exaggerate this contrast. So, too, would the desert's quieter sculptors, dew, humidity cycling, the slow pump of groundwater that brings salt up to glitter in hairline cracks before it blooms and pushes grains apart. If you watch long enough, you might notice that the deepest runnels tend to align with weaknesses in the stone, joints and bedding planes, places any weathering agent would exploit. The Sphinx does not have a single enemy, it has a committee. And there is the question of position. The statue sits low, where water, whether from ancient rainstorms or rare modern downpours or simple runoff from higher ground, would naturally collect and move. The enclosure acts like a catch basin. Over millennia, even infrequent events can carve deeply, especially if maintenance is periodic rather than constant. Put a monument this size in a bathtub of its own making and time will find a way to write on it. Yet none of this dissolves the tug you feel when you stand here and imagine another sky. It takes so little to flick the scene into a wetter key. A bank of clouds piling in from the north. The sandstone brow of the Sphinx slick with a recent shower. The sound of drips decanting from ledges into shallow pools. Imagine seasons when such days were not exotic news but a rhythm, rain that darkened the stone each year for years on end. Under such a drum, these grooves are inevitable. The question is not whether water can do this, it is when it did this, and whether the critical carving came before or after. Part of what keeps the argument honest is its refusal to settle for a cartoon. Proponents of an older Sphinx do not claim the Old Kingdom left no mark, they point to recarving and restoration, to faces that might have been reshaped to wear royal features. Mainstream scholars do not claim the desert is inert, they brandish repair phases and salt as villains as potent as storms. Both sides, when careful, admit the other's best points. Both become less persuasive when they pretend the wall speaks only one dialect. There is, tucked into the corner of the enclosure, a lesson we will carry forward. Stone tells us what has happened to it more readily than who did what when. The Sphinx's back bears patchwork masonry, its paws have been bandaged more than once. It has been a patient for most of its life. Whether the first injury was inflicted by an age of rain before Kafr's masons ever set up their lines, or by the long breath of desert conditions after they left, remains the riddle. The grooves do not resolve into a date, they lean, suggest, and refuse. So we step back into the light with a useful humility. The neat, museum-ready answer, "Wind did it, full stop," does not fit in this pit. Neither does the grand, all-solving romance, "Rain did it 10,000 years ago," without qualifiers and context. What we can say, as our eyes adjust, is that the enclosure walls have confessions to make, and those confessions complicate the timeline we inherited. They do not break it, they make it interesting. They ask us to weigh geology and inscription together, to imagine a plateau that has been both drier and wetter than our snapshots suggest, and to be patient with stone that speaks in slow syllables. From here, we will follow the runoff outward, to the valley temple blocks, to tool marks that blur the line between craft and mystery, to climates and skies that turn history's edges rough. For now, remember the feeling of your hand on that fluted wall, cool, damp in the mind if not in fact, carved by agents that do not care for our categories. The Sphinx has been rained on. The question is time. Every so often the desert coughs up something it has been hiding with a miser's patience, and for a moment our tidy charts stutter. A shard with a pattern no one expects. A wall that lies the wrong way. An object asleep in a trench far from the water that should have carried it. These intrusions don't overturn history the way a wave knocks a child's tower flat. They do something subtler, they lean against the tower and make us wonder how sound the base really is. Most days, historians stare at the enormous mass of evidence that does behave. On certain days, an anomaly wanders into the room and clears its throat. Take the hills of southeastern Turkey. On a rounded limestone knoll we now call Göbekli Tepe, people 11.5 millennia ago, long before cities, long before pottery in common use, raised circles of towering T-shaped pillars and carved them with foxes, snakes, cranes, boar, and abstract bands like belts cinched around stone torsos. Some of those pillars weigh as much as a truck. The site is preposterously early by the old ladder we like to climb, first farming, then villages, then temples. Göbekli Tepe blurs the wrong order. It suggests that the urge to gather and build for ceremony may have helped pull people into the routines that became agriculture, not the other way around. No, it does not prove that the pyramids are Ice Age veterans in disguise. It shows that human hands were shaping stone with ambition at a time when we used to imagine the world held only small fires and short lives. It widens the canvas on which any argument about Giza must be painted. Widening the canvas matters because deserts are not just empty space, they are archives with strange filing systems. Miles from any harbor, archaeologists in Egypt have found boats that spent centuries under sand instead of water, cedar planks stacked in sleeping order beside the Great Pyramid, a full-sized funerary craft sealed into a limestone-lined pit, an ancient fleet buried at Abydos, hulls slotted into the desert floor near a royal precinct, other later vessels whose timbers survived because the wind wrapped them and the sun dried them and then forgot where it put them. A ship in the desert is not a miracle. It is a reminder that the ground itself edits the story, sometimes savagely. If wood can wait for millennia a few meters from a monument that millions visit, then we have no right to assume that absence equals non-existence in the less traveled reaches of the plateau or the drowned shelves of the delta. Anomalies do their best work when we stop using them like trump cards. It's tempting to pick up Göbekli Tepe and slam it on the table. Look, builders without kings, therefore kings are optional, therefore Giza can be anything. But history is not a chain of therefore. It is a braid of maybe and likely, and here is the part we can actually show you. The pillars in Turkey tell us that organized labor, symbolic art, and astronomical attention did not wait politely for the invention of tax receipts. They also tell us that cultures can coordinate on a large scale without leaving behind the bureaucratic paper trail later ages produce by the stack. That lesson, carried carefully, can travel to Egypt without getting drunk on itself. It says, do not dismiss a possibility just because your bookshelf cannot see it. It does not say, rewrite everything because one hill said something surprising. When you hold that lesson and walk back into Egypt, the landscape begins to flicker with hints. Out in the western desert, the rock art shows giraffes and hippos pacing through scenes that look like postcards from a wetter world. In the eastern desert, scratched boats cross canyon walls, their prows raised as if they're cutting an invisible current. Around Giza itself, the discovery and painstaking reconstruction of a pharaoh's boat, planks drilled and stitched, cedar freighted all the way from the Levant, prove that ancient logistics were already reaching across horizons. That is not evidence that the plateau bears Ice Age scars. It is evidence that what seems improbable at first glance often shrinks to plausible once you step closer and let your eyes adjust. There's a rhythm to the way anomalies arrive. First comes the gasp, how could this be here? Then the scramble for fit, could it belong to a later intrusion, a reuse, an accident of geology? Then the cooling of the blood as context accumulates, layers, associated finds, tool marks, residues, dates you can hang your hat on. Sometimes the anomaly ends up wearing a perfectly ordinary uniform after all. Sometimes it keeps its strange clothes and forces the room to change dress code. Göbekli Tepe did the latter. The desert boats occupy a middle space, at once exactly where ritual logic says they should be, for the dead, for the sun, for the king's journey, and exactly where everyday logic says they should not, under sand, far from water. Their value is not in proving theories about Giza. It is in training our expectations to stop treating sand as silence. Stand again beside the Great Pyramid's flank. The blocks nearest your knee are unglamorous, chalky, nicked, scattered with ancient shell fragments. They look like building, not mystery. And yet within walking distance a ship lay collapsed into a kind of wooden equation that patient hands solved plank by plank into a hull that still smells faintly of resin in time. Within a day's travel, a hill in another country forces us to admit that mass and meaning in stone did not wait for bureaucrats. This is how anomalies whisper. They do not demand that we start believing in lost cities made of lasers. They ask us to make just enough room in our heads for earlier than we thought, for organized without kings, for preserved where we assumed nothing survives. That is a difficult ask because neatness feels like safety. Linear timelines give us a place to stand. If you have ever assembled flat-pack furniture, you know the relief of numbered parts and pre-drilled holes. Deep time is not flat-pack. Its instructions are half missing, written in a language that changes tense unexpectedly, with images that only sometimes match what's in the box. Anomalies are not here to be worshipped. They are here to keep us honest when we start pretending our diagram is the same thing as the object on the table. And honesty in this case means holding contradictory possibilities at once without letting either one claim the throne. It is entirely possible that the Sphinx was carved in the Old Kingdom and later suffered in ways that make its enclosure look older to a geologist's eye. It is also possible that parts of the plateau preserve work that began earlier than our dynastic anchors admit. Göbekli Tepe gives the second scenario permission to exist without giving it proof. The desert boats grant our imagination a license to picture buried complexity without issuing a passport that says, Ice Age Engineers. Evidence does not have to choose our adventure for us. It only has to make sure the path we pick isn't blocked by the things we refuse to see. The best reason to spend time with anomalies is not that they are glamorous, it is that they are humbling. They tell us we have missed things, not because we were foolish, but because the earth is an expert at hiding its own drafts. They remind us that museums glow with the survivors, not the whole population. For every perfect statue, how many chipped ones fed a lime kiln? For every named king, how many makers put their strength into stone and left only the curve of a chisel to represent them? For every monument standing in air, how many lie drowned under the shelf where the Nile once met the sea? When we carry that humility forward, we are better prepared for the next step in our journey, imagining Giza when clouds mattered more and the air smelled of rain. The anomalies have done their work. They have loosened the lid on the box, just enough. They have taught us to let possibility sit without making it wear a crown. From here, we can risk a longer look at a greener plateau, not as a fantasy, but as a climate chapter many deserts keep in their back matter. We are not trading caution for romance. We are trading a narrow certainty for a larger, more truthful doubt. And in that doubt, the stones begin to speak a little louder. Picture the same plateau you know, but tilt the season. The air is cooler, denser, clouds have the look of cloth rather than smoke. Last night a storm walked in from the north and spent itself on limestone. Now the Sphinx is beaded with droplets that gather at the brow and fall in patient ticks. Shallow pools hang in the quarry floor like shattered mirrors, and the cut walls of the enclosure are darkened to the color of tea. The wind carries scents you don't associate with Giza: wet dust, crushed leaves, the faint vegetal sweetness of water standing where it has no modern right to stand. When you step, your heel prints hold their shape in damp sand before relaxing, as if the ground itself is exhaling. You are standing in a memory, not yours, but the plateau's. There was a time when the Sahara carried green in its pockets and the Nile breathed bigger, a chapter we now call the African humid period. The planet's slow tilt and wobble nudged rains northward, monsoon arms reached farther than they do today, lakes glittered in depressions where only gravel and wind live now. In such seasons, the plateau would not have been the stage set of beige minimalism you have seen in photographs. Grasses would have taken the bite out of slopes. Shrubs would have stood like small custodians among rock outcrops. Runoff would have learned the enclosures and stair-stepped ledges by heart, visiting them year after year like a persistent relative. This is not romance, it is climate. Water writes itself into stone with a script we can still read. Walk the enclosure after rain, real or imagined, and every groove is a sentence in that script. The long flutes that pull toward the base, the softened irises, the small pockets where droplets collect and spin, they are what persistent water does to limestone over time. The Sphinx, carved directly from the bedrock, sits low in a basin that might as well be a catchment. When rain is frequent, water doesn't just touch this place, it lingers, it argues, it insists. Even under a drier regime, rare cloudbursts can do violence. The desert teaches economy. 1 hour of rain can mimic a season if the ground is bare and the slope is eager. We have seen modern rehearsal notes for this older play. In the 1970s, a storm in North Africa dumped so much water in a single day that rivers sprang up along dry wadis, clawing new channels where elderly maps showed none. Flash floods are not a theory here, they are an occasional mood. Scale that mood to a climate where storms were not news but pattern, and the plateau's fluted stone begins to make a certain sense whether your dates sit purely within the dynastic timeline or lean back toward wetter centuries before it. The Sphinx does not suffer alone. Move from the enclosure to the buildings it faces, the Sphinx Temple and the Valley Temple, and the puzzle widens. The limestone of those structures carries a weathering that, in places, reads rougher than the Sphinx's own hide. Some blocks look as though they have been under a patient cascade, others are abraded and fretted in ways that whisper of more than wind. The temples themselves are megalithic puzzles, enormous core blocks of limestone sheathed in granite, and the limestone courses in particular sometimes show a rounding and scalloping that feels like the signature of water rather than the nibble of sand alone. Whatever the precise sequence of building and refacing, the complex as a whole looks like it has had a long conversation with wet. Climb the causeway in your mind on a day like the one we are imagining. Think of runoff from the higher ground above the Sphinx. Water does not fall and then forget, it seeks the minimum path, returns, and chisels that path deeper. The plateau's stratigraphy helps it along, harder beds stand out like shelves, softer beds retreat and become gutters. Over years, decades, centuries, the unit of time depends on how generous the sky is, those gutters deepen into runnels, and the walls begin to look draped, melted, sagged. This is the language we noted in the enclosure. It is also, at smaller scales, the language you can read on blocks around the temples where relief and weakness welcome the same insistence. None of this forces you to leap out of the Old Kingdom. The climate chapter overlaps with dynastic dates. The Nile can be expansive even when the Sahara at large is drying. Ancient maintenance and repair, visible in the bandaging of the Sphinx's paws and chest, tells us that water damage and weathering were problems whenever the statue was exposed. But a plateau that knows rain not as a rumor but as a rhythm changes how we stage the work of stone and how we imagine its early life. It makes reasonable the idea that the first cuts in certain places were made into rock that expected to be wet again. It makes reasonable the idea that seasonal pooling collected in the same pockets so regularly that masons began to fight an old opponent with fresh blocks and faces. There is a practical side to the greener picture that is easy to overlook because the romance of rain movies the mind. Abundant water makes human logistics simpler. Crews don't have to import every sip. Mud is abundant for ramps and fills. Sledges slide more willingly on dampened causeways. Food grows with less anxiety nearby, which means workers spend fewer hours hauling provisions and more hours shaping and placing stone. The Nile itself, swollen by rains far to the south and matched by tributaries the desert has long since forgotten, becomes a wider conveyor. Granite from Aswan and limestone from local quarries arrive to the beat of a river with more patience. But the plateau is not a single equation. The same water that greases sledges chews at corners. The same rains that feed fields bite at the Sphinx's flanks. The builders, whether you situate them firmly in the 4th dynasty or allow for earlier phases of cutting and later phases of adoption, were not naive to this. The cased surfaces, the granite sheathing in the Valley Temple, the repeated ancient repairs, they are all records of a long negotiation with wet. To walk these structures with that negotiation in mind is to see less mystery and more maintenance, a complex made to look immortal by people who understood perfectly well that it wasn't. Now hold the greener age against the desert we know. The difference is not just color, it is tempo. In a humid period, weathering speaks in quick, legible strokes. In aridity, it murmurs and waits for opportunities, salt blooms in microcracks, dew brings and takes, rare storms do the work of a dozen seasons in one reach. The stone carries both accents. In the enclosure, there is rain's cursive, on exposed faces above, the rasp of wind. One doesn't erase the other. The wall refuses to take sides. If you want a small, local proof that this landscape can shift gears more quickly than a textbook timeline likes, look at vegetation that colonizes in a single wet spring, holding dunes in place for a season before dying back and letting the sand remember its travel plans. Scale that to centuries. The plateau's recent past, our past, is a dry epilogue. Its middle chapters are mixed. Its prologue wears cloud. We have to be careful with what our caution is for. It isn't meant to get the image of a wetter Giza until only beige remains, it is meant to keep us from making water do too much work. Rain can explain the flute of a wall without requiring a lost civilization. Salt can mimic softness in stone without erasing the possibility that real ponds once napped here after storms. The plateau's strength as a teacher is that it lets these truths coexist without one stabbing the other. So keep this day of cloud in mind as we move on. The Sphinx's enclosure and the nearby temples have not only been sanded by time, they have been rinsed, occasionally drowned, and then bandaged. Picture masons working under an overcast sky, mortar damp on their hands, listening to thunder over a river wider than ours. Picture gullies that wake each season and sink a little deeper into the pit. Picture the monument as a patient, stubbornly alive in a climate with moods. If you can hold that picture, the next questions, about whether some of this stone was inherited or initiated, whether some faces were recut rather than first cut, begin to feel less like heresy and more like a continuation of something the weather itself has been telling us. The plateau does not remember with words. It remembers with grooves and stains, with mineral veils where water once paused, with the dull polish of 1,000 rains. That memory is not a verdict, it is an atmosphere. Step out of the enclosure into the clearing light and you can feel it evaporate the way a puddle does, slowly, reluctantly, leaving a thin crust that says only, at some time not your time, there was more sky in this stone. Imagine a monument that isn't born all at once, but accumulates, like a reef, layer by layer, hand by hand, each generation leaving a skin of intention over the bones of its predecessor. That is one way to read the plateau, not as a single decision executed swiftly under a single crown name, but as a palimpsest in stone. The ink beneath is older, the script above is royal, and between them runs a seam that refuses to tell us where authorship truly starts. The official narrative sets the fourth dynasty here like an anchor: Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure, their pyramids, their temples, their causeways. But step closer and the joints begin to suggest another possibility, both humbler and more radical, that some of what the kings claimed, they first found. The idea is not an insult to their genius, it is a tribute to how power behaves around the durable. Rulers inherit landscapes the way we inherit furniture. If you discover a perfect table in the attic, old, sturdy, silent, you don't discard it. You polish it, add an inscription, maybe recut a leg that's gone soft, and set your feast upon it as if it had been made for you. The plateau, viewed in this light, is a royal dining room furnished by time. Perhaps there was already mass here, cores that made sense to keep, alignments too potent to ignore, platforms positioned like thoughts someone else had started. The fourth dynasty, with bureaucracy, quarries, and theology to spare, could have formalized and faced what was waiting, wrapping older geometry in the crisp grammar of their age, casing stones that flashed, granite veneers that spoke the language of eternity, causeways that tied earth to cult. There is nothing far-fetched about splicing new sacredness onto old stone. The habit has a long and very human pedigree. The Romans lifted columns from older temples and set them in basilicas, the way a musician samples a phrase and gives it new rhythm. Medieval cathedrals grew from Roman foundations, their apses settling into footprints first drawn by the empire. The obelisks that once pointed Egyptian prayers skyward later pierced Roman skies as trophies, their hieroglyphs becoming a foreign script of power in a new capital. In Egypt itself, kings repurposed blocks carved by enemies or ancestors, names were cut out and overwritten, sanctuaries expanded by swallowing neighboring shrines. To stand in front of any ancient wall and expect it to be a single, pure moment is to misunderstand how time uses stone. So why should Giza be exempt? Picture the plateau at dawn in that imagined earlier age we have been circling. People move with a different urgency than the courtly pace we picture for pharaohs. There are no cartouches, no reliefs trumpeting victories, no long inventories of offerings. The lines of their architecture, if we can call it that, are stripped of ego, plinths and platforms, straight runs and careful corners, less a monument to a person than a place to do something that mattered in common. Later, when a dynasty arrives with scribes and standards, power does what it always does with ambiguity, it clarifies. Edges are sharpened, faces carved, alignments refreshed, chapels fitted in where none existed. Perhaps a statue's head is reshaped to bear the features of a living monarch, perhaps a weathered ledge is refaced with fresh limestone, perhaps rough, ancient interior cores are jacketed in fine, modern, for them, casing that declares, with every white plane, ownership. If you think of it this way, the variability you can see in the stone starts to feel less like sloppiness and more like layers in a manuscript. Some joints meet with a whisper, so tight you could slide a razor blade and feel it hesitate. Others are honest about their origins, irregular, chipped, as if cut by hands with different training, or by tools whose temper had changed. A pyramid face can wear a shirt of elegance over a torso of blocks that do not match one another's diction. In the temples below, megalithic limestone cores hold themselves like veteran shoulders, while granite sheathing, imported, polished, emphatic, reads as a later suit tailored to an older frame. Once you've seen palimpsest work in mud brick towns and later shrines, you begin to suspect it everywhere the past and power meet. What are the stakes of reading Giza this way? They are not small. If the 4th dynasty adopted and adapted older mass, if some cores or platforms or alignments were inherited, then Egypt's architectural story isn't a sudden, blinding leap from mud brick to the greatest stones ever set. It is a climb up a staircase with a few steps still buried. That does not dethrone the pharaohs, it reframes their genius as editorial as well as authorial. It suggests that when they wrote in stone they sometimes revised, restored, expanded, and claimed rather than composed from nothing. It implies an earlier grammar of building along the Nile, not necessarily as large, not necessarily as formal, whose vocabulary survives where it was most stubborn, in weight and in place. Skeptics will ask, rightly, for artifacts. Where are the earlier tools, the earlier trash heaps, the earlier footprints of a workforce? Palimpsests are beautiful metaphors until you have to prove one in the dirt. The answer is both unsatisfying and true. Reuse erases. When you turn an old wall into a new one, you devour the evidence of its first life. When you reface a block, you make the previous skin disappear. When you clean a site to make it worthy of your god or your king, you do the archaeologist of the future no favors. Add to that the way rivers shift and bury their banks, the way deserts grind and then preserve, the way cities build over cities, and you have a recipe for gaps. Our neat earliest inscriptions cling to later surfaces because earlier ones were cannibalized or worn away. To expect a tidy trove of preface drafts beside the finished book is to forget how thorough a good edit can be. None of this asks you to abandon the dynastic timeline that ties the Sphinx to Khafre's complex and binds names to stones. The causeway is still there. The valley temple still turns its granite face toward the river. The quarries still show bites that correspond to the volumes in the walls. What this view asks instead is a smaller, subtler concession, that when power meets stone, it often chooses to inherit before it invents, that the plateau may hold, under its crisp 4th dynasty surfaces, older mass or older intention, that the kings, like all great editors, knew how to make someone else's strong paragraph read as if they had written it. If you stand quietly where the causeway rises and look down at the Sphinx, you can almost see the edits. A patched paw that keeps weather at bay. Blocks along the chest that betray ancient bandaging. Faces on temple blocks that have lost their sharpness, as if resketched over an older drawing. The whole complex feels like a conversation that began before the pharaohs and was steered by them toward their gods, their stars, their afterlives. Theirs is the voice we hear because they carved it in, loud and formal. But in the pauses, in the odd block, the mismatched seam, the resurfaced wall, you can sometimes hear the earlier speaker clear their throat. Cross-cultural precedent helps us grant the possibility without insisting on it. No one blinks when a medieval church swallows a Roman doorway, when a mosque incorporates pharaonic columns, when a European square is paved with stones scavenged from casualty buildings, when a temple is enlarged by quarrying its neighbor. Spolia is not a scandal, it's a habit. If entire empires treated old stone as a quarry of ready-made sanctity, why should we assume that a fourth dynasty confident enough to organize labor by the tens of thousands would not also be practical enough to adopt what lay to hand, especially if what lay to hand was already aligned to sky and river in a way that pleased them? There's a gentler way to put it. Inheritance is not theft, it is continuity. If the plateau is a palimpsest, then the kings participated in a conversation older than their names. They added syntax and shine. They did what power does, claim, polish, direct. But they also did what tradition does, preserve, respect, adapt. That double motion is visible in the stone if you let your eyes relax. The past here is not a single block, it is a wall built over time, with some courses older than others, some mortar new, some worn to the grain. You can love the neatness of the royal story and still admit the possibility that beneath the linen rhetoric lie older hands, older alignments, older intentions, pressed into service by later genius. Imagine, before we move on, one small scene. A team of 4th dynasty masons stands before an inherited face of limestone, scarred, pitted, but strong. The overseer runs his palm across it, measuring with the skin what the eye cannot quite see. He nods. "We keep this," he says, and marks a line where casing will hide the age without erasing it. He orders granite hauled and polished for the temple's facade, because granite speaks the new language of forever. He points to a weathered ledge and calls for a refacing. The old work vanishes behind the new, but its mass remains, carrying the weight as it always has. The pharaoh will come to see it and his name will be written in places the old builders never imagined. Pilgrims will arrive, and priests will chant. Centuries will pass, sand will rise, storms will fret, and later hands will patch the same places again. That is what a palimpsest looks like in slow motion, not deception, but devotion to continuity in a world where even stone needs maintenance. If the plateau is such a page, then our task is not to decide whether one text erases the other. It is to learn how to read both at once, to listen for the older voice under the royal one, and to accept that the truth here, like the best inscriptions, was cut in layers. From that acceptance, the next question becomes less inflammatory and more inevitable. If inheritance is possible, where do the tool marks and the logistics leave their fingerprints on that handover? We'll go looking for them next, in the problem of granite and copper, in drill grooves and seams so neat they look like arguments for lost techniques. For now, keep the image of the edited wall with you. It makes sense of the plateau without robbing it of wonder. Stand in the shadow of the Great Pyramid and look not up but down. The glamour is in the angles, the celestial brag, the way 4 planes meet the sky with a precision that still makes surveyors squint. But the truth of any monument lives in its surfaces. Run your hand along the exposed core blocks and you feel 1,000 small decisions, where a mason chose to leave a ridge proud because it locked better to its neighbor, where a corner has been worried thin by centuries of fingertips, where the chisel's bite changes character as if a different wrist took over mid-stroke. The official story of Giza's making is practical: thousands of workers, copper chisels, dolerite pounding stones, wooden sledges, ramps packed with wet mud and grit. Limestone yields to copper, slowly, stubbornly, but it yields. That much the stones and experiments agree on. Then you encounter granite. Granite is a different conversation. It is hard in a way your hand understands the first time you touch it, a density that answers pressure with indifference. The Great Pyramid's inner architecture uses it with confidence: beams and ceiling slabs in the king's chamber, the rougher chest we call a sarcophagus, blocking stones, details that had to work the first time because there is very little forgiveness when you are moving 30, 40, 60 tons of refusal through narrow spaces. Granite does not listen to copper. Copper blunts, granite smiles and keeps its shape. So you pick up heavier arguments, dolerite pounders to spall the surface, sand and emery mixed with water to turn a copper tube into a grinding drill, copper saws with abrasive slurry to slowly wear a kerf. All of these work on a small scale. Modern craftspeople and experimental archaeologists have done it, holes bored into granite with a copper tube and quartz sand, saw marks raised like tiny ridgelines where the grit walked the blade forward, polished planes coaxed into existence by patience and powdered stone. It is possible. It is also painfully, mind-numbingly slow. Now put the possible next to the evidence. In certain places, the king's chamber especially, but not only there, granite surfaces have a finish that looks like intention, not accident, planes that meet in honest angles, edges true to the point your fingernail catches on nothing. On other faces, the story is more blunt, long shallow cuts as if a blade walked there, circular holes with internal spirals like a thread frozen in stone. If you shine a raking light across some of those holes, the grooves appear to wind downward in a steady pitch, a pattern that whispers of rotation and pressure rather than random abrasion. The cautious mind says, sand and a tube can, eventually, carve a spiral simply because grit embeds unevenly and rides the tool as it turns. The impatient eye says, this looks like a machine. It is very easy to fall out of the patient middle when you stand in front of a granite block that seems to have been persuaded rather than bullied. The mind leaps, if they could do this, what else did they know? But the plateau teaches discipline. Every lost tech fantasy must pass through the bottleneck of what we can show with hands and materials of the time. When researchers take copper tubes, weigh them down, spin them with bow drills and manpower, and feed sand and water, they do cut granite. It takes hours to get a few millimeters, days to reach the depth of a wrist. The grooves produced are messy, not the clean threads a mind raised on machine shops expects. Yet under certain conditions, with the right abrasive size and steady force, you can coax a quasi-spiral that fools a casual glance. There is another path, pounding first, precision later. Dolerite, that black, tough rock the Egyptians exploited from boulder fields, can shatter granite crystals and knock the surface into a rough compliance. Once the heavy work is done, you switch tools. Abrasives with copper for the geometry. Rubbing stones with sand for the polish. This is how a world without steel solves a problem that feels like it requires it, by multiplying time, bodies, and grit until material gives up. It is not glamorous. It is an industrial miracle built on the discipline of repetition. Still, even after you've sworn fidelity to patience, you stumble on places where the fit seems to laugh at your vows. In the relieving spaces above the king's chamber, granite beams stretch from wall to wall, their undersides astonishingly flat for members that long and heavy. In the gallery below, courses of limestone rise in a corbel that reads as rigor rather than rough stacking, the central slot so consistent you feel as if you are walking inside a decision. Elsewhere, around the plateau and in other Old Kingdom sites, you can find granite boxes polished within and square in a way that makes modern machinists lean close and mutter. Again, the cautious voice has good answers, meticulous abrasion on reference surfaces, check and correct routines that build accuracy slowly as surfaces are mated and compared, clever jigs that leave no archaeological trace because they were wood and rope and sense. The impatient voice keeps asking whether we have forgotten a trick that was once common and has since evaporated because no one needed it after the monumental era ended. The strongest argument for patience is in the variability. Not every block is perfect. Not every joint whispers. There are places where the seams are honest gaps filled with mortar, places where a corner has wandered, places where the polish stops and the tool mark shows its grain. If an age of hidden steel and precise machines lurks behind the Fourth Dynasty, it is remarkably shy about showing up consistently. What you see instead is a range, rough to exquisite, good to uncanny, often within a few steps of one another. That range is exactly what you expect from human craft writ large, teams with different skills, overseers with different tolerances for good enough, projects that span seasons and groups, repairs introduced into original fabric, the kind of layering that a palimpsest invites. The marvel is not that everything is perfect. The marvel is how often the work approaches a perfection that would chew through modern patience without better tools. There is also a logistical shadow behind every polished surface. Granite does not live at Giza, it lives in Aswan, far to the south. Blocks had to be cut there, by pounding, by splitting along drilled lines, by exploiting natural fractures, and then moved hundreds of kilometers north, likely by river during the flood when cargo rides higher. Picture the staging: quarry scars, wedges driven into grooves and watered to swell until the stone pops, barges boasting enough beam to keep a multi-ton load stable on a current, ramps and sledges and teams that know exactly how much water to pour to make friction relax. By the time a beam shows up in the king's chamber, the material has been through a gauntlet of planning so dense that the finishing polish almost feels like a victory lap. Yet the puzzle persists at the scale of the fingertip. You place your hand on a granite face in dim light and it reflects like still water. You study a hole and see a spiral that looks too regular for a day spent grinding sand. You run your knuckle along a seam and it barely clicks. The mind cycles through options. Are we seeing the result of lost abrasives harder than quartz? Of copper tools clenched with stone inserts? Of lathes powered by more bodies than we care to imagine? Or are we simply misjudging what time and skill can do when harnessed to a purpose that convinces a whole society to spend season after season in a choreography of stone? A third voice, quieter, older, offers another possibility that lives between romance and reduction. Techniques fall out of use and vanish faster than you think. Polynesian navigators crossed oceans with star compasses and wave-reading skills that nearly disappeared once the world moved to sextants and charts. Roman concrete made harbors that cured underwater and shrugged off centuries of salt. The recipe was misunderstood for 1,000 years. A single generation that doesn't need a method is usually enough to break the chain. If some old kingdom teams had perfected ways to true faces and drill holes that we have not yet replicated elegantly with their toolkit, it would not require an alien machine. It would require a tradition that ended when the drive to move such masses of stone eased. The knowledge would remain fossilized in the results, not in the texts, because the texts we have are few and the workshops were made of wood. This, too, explains the unevenness. Techniques migrate unevenly across crews, specialists age and die. A trick held in the hands of a master does not always become a curriculum. What we are touching may be the residue of excellence rather than the proof of unseen iron. That reading puts the marvel back where it belongs, in human beings who learn to make stone do what it does not want to do by listening to it for a very long time. Hold that thought as we step into more contentious territory in the next stretch: names painted where no tourist goes, blocks that seem to tie quarries to temples like the ends of a sentence, and the awkward fact that ownership in archaeology often hangs from a few faint letters. Tool marks matter in that argument because they are the grammar of making. They tell us who spoke, in what register, and for how long. For now, let your fingertips learn the difference between limestone's chalk and granite's glass. One can be coaxed by copper, the other demands either a village of patience or a trick we have yet to recover. Perhaps the plateau contains both, villages and tricks, stacked in courses like meaning. The stone, as always, refuses to annotate. It is generous with evidence and stingy with explanation. Our job is to read without rushing the verdict. Names make claims. In a landscape of anonymous stone, the first painted word is a flag. Deep inside the Great Pyramid, in cramped spaces no visitor sees, there are names written in red, a ragged ledger of gangs and guardians. Friends of Khufu. The Drunks of Menkor is a famous crew name elsewhere. Here, atop the king's chamber, the quarry marks repeat the royal cartouche of Khnum Khufu in a hand that looks both casual and official at once. They are not hieroglyphs arranged for worship, they are worksite graffiti, the kind of thing a crew chief scrawls on a beam when a course is finished and everyone is tired and proud. In 1837, an English officer, Colonel Howard Vyse, blasted his way into these relieving spaces and found them, red ochre gang marks, tallying labor, blessing a king. For many, that settled it. The Great Pyramid belonged to Khufu because his name was written where only builders would have had reason to write. But names have their own weather. Almost as soon as Weiss published his drawings, doubt took root. The charges have shifted over the years: sloppy copying, misread signs, the possibility of later intrusions, even outright forgery, but the feeling behind them is ancient, too convenient, too perfect, too decisive. Skeptics pointed out that if you wanted to fix ownership in a monument with no inscription, a red cartouche in a hidden place would do the trick. Mainstream scholars countered that the marks look exactly like what they should: crew names, gangs named for the reigning king, oriented in ways that make sense given how the blocks were laid. The paint lies partly on surfaces that would have been hidden at the time of construction, smeared into corners in the way a hurried brush behaves. The writing is not the careful, public script of a temple wall, it is the quick hand of progress notes in a place no priest would kneel. Middle ground exists, as always. The marks are genuine, the discovery method's brash, the cartouche ties the work to Khufu, but does not fingerprint every block. Step back from personalities and you find a more interesting problem than forgery or faith. Ownership in archaeology often hangs from threads this thin. A painted sign here, a seal impression there, a jar label found in the rubble and assumed to speak for the finished work. The logic can be sound: gangs do name themselves for kings, cartouches do travel with state projects, the quarrying for Khufu's pyramid demonstrably chewed into the very stone of the plateau. Yet a monument of such mass leaves shockingly few lines of text saying, Khufu made this, in the places we might expect. So we rely on context, the way the pyramid complexes, causeways and temples align with the river and necropolis, the mastaba fields that blossom in the king's horizon, the administrative papyri that, centuries later and miles away, still describe crews hauling stone and receiving rations in a system that must have been perfected in projects like this. We build a net of likely and let it hold. Names, though, are only one kind of claim a monument makes. Tool marks are another. The Valley and Sphinx temples carry blocks whose surfaces have been reworked and refaced more than once. On some, faint lines crisscross like the grain in a plank, the trace of a copper saw with abrasive slurry walking forward, step by microscopic step. On others, pounding scars bloom in clusters, dolerite signature. A few joints fit so sweetly that mortar seems ornamental. Nearby, a seam opens to a sliver you can insert a fingertip into as if the team grew tired at the end of the day. This variability tells a story of generations rather than a single season. Places favored by tiers of masons weather at different rates because they were born at different times. A recut face sheds water differently than an original quarry skin, a patched corner takes the sun another way. Walk long enough among these seams and you start to hear the edits, repair layered on repair, dynasty speaking over dynasty without entirely silencing the previous voice. Then there is the matter of stone's biography before it ever arrived here. In Aswan, the unfinished obelisk lies fused to its cradle, a 1,000-ton ambition abandoned when fractures spidered through the granite. It bears the clearest marginalia a quarry can give, channels cut around its flanks, pound marks marching in lines, wedge holes that promised a parting that never came. You can stand over that sleeping needle and feel both the reach and the limit of ancient method, the way technique scaled up to the brink of what geology would allow and then had to retreat when the material said no. Everything at Giza that is granite had to survive a similar negotiation: cut, free, haul to the river, float north when the flood threw a blue road at the desert, land at a quay, and climb again. A beam laid over the king's chamber has already lived a life before it ever met the polish that startles your fingers centuries later. Reuse complicates ownership further. Egypt is a museum of spolia. Kings took blocks from predecessors and enemies with equal fervor, redressed old stone to carry their names, erased cartouches that politics had made dangerous, and fit older sanctity into new frames. The habit was practical: good stone is precious, and theological: power inherits as much as it invents. In later periods, whole temples were dismantled to feed lime kilns, column drums became thresholds in village houses, fallen statues were reimagined as grinding stones. The Fourth Dynasty was not immune to any of this. If earlier platforms or rough massing existed on the plateau, adopting them would have been shrewd rather than scandalous. A king's name would still be the name that mattered, the theology would still fit. The wall would still stand because the core held. Against that background, the red marks in the relieving spaces feel less like isolated proof and more like part of a chorus. The quarries at the pyramid's foot match voids in the monument. The causeways bind pyramid, valley temple, and floodplain with 4th dynasty grammar. The mastabas that array around Khufu's horizon bear the bureaucratic signature of his administration, the tombs of officials whose careers braided with the king's. The painted cartouches tucked into cramped chambers ask to be read alongside all this, not apart from it. Do they settle every question about authorship? No. They do what names have always done in stone, they declare an intention to be remembered as the source. But stone does not obey intention easily. It holds memory the way a coastline holds lines of driftwood from different storms. On some blocks, faint ink survives on surfaces later hidden by neighbors, the equivalent of a carpenter's mark on tenants that no guest will see. On others, the only writing is the chisels. A mason's rhythm becomes a kind of signature in the aggregate, his ratio of blow to advance, the way he favors one angle over another when truing a face. In places where very old blocks have been recut, the first skin peeks through at corners and chases, telling you more about continuity than any king list does. These are claims as strong as paint, if you learn how to read them. Which brings us back to the question that bothers and delights at once: how much of Giza is proclamation and how much is inheritance? If your answer is, all proclamation, you must explain the palimpsest evidence, the patches, the mixed seams, the way some stones wear ages that do not quite match their neighbors. If your answer is, mostly inheritance, you owe the causeways, the funerary temples, the administrative world that obviously flowers around these forms in the 4th dynasty. The stones themselves refuse to polarize. The cartouche inside the pyramid sits beside a joint that is not perfect, the perfect joint sits beside a patch, the patch abuts a block whose quarry skin tells you it was exposed in the weather for a long interlude before it was finally swallowed by masonry. Instead of a verdict, we are left with a layered sentence whose clauses qualify each other. There is an honesty in that ambiguity that feels right for this place. Kings claimed, masons repaired, earlier masses may have been incorporated, later hands bandaged what both climate and time undid. The red names above the king's chamber are not the only truth about ownership here, but they are not a trick either. They are field notes from the work itself, a rare moment when labor leaves its voice in a building that otherwise prefers to speak without words. Outside, the sun climbs, and the pyramid keeps its angular composure while the city's noise rises like a tide that never quite reaches the base. Inside, in a slit of space hardly anyone will ever see, someone once lifted a brush and wrote a king's name with a pragmatist's care. If we are wise, we take both kinds of testimony seriously, the name and the seam, the cartouche and the corner. Neither cancels the other. Together, they sketch a method, read the boasts, read the repairs, imagine the handover between generations, be suspicious of any single detail that claims to settle the whole. And then walk on. The next rooms in this inquiry are cut from older questions, granite beams laid like arguments across the centuries, drill spirals that play tricks with our patience, and the quiet logistics that transform quarries into architecture. Names can start a story. Tool marks and transport finish it. Stand here and peel the desert back with a fingertip the way you might lift a sheet. Beneath today's beige lies another Egypt, colder at night, softer by day, its edges damp. Far to the north, ice sits on continents like another kind of mountain, and the world seas huddle lower in their basins by 100 meters or more, the shorelines redrawn in chalk no one living has seen. The Mediterranean stretches out past its modern curve, the Nile Delta is a long, tapering tongue, pushing farther into the shallows, islands that now stand alone are stitched to mainlands by wide plains. No glaciers grind through Egypt itself, but the country feels the pull of the frozen belt all the same. Winds rear out. Rains stumble forward, then retreat. The Sahara is not yet a uniform verdict of sand, it keeps pockets of grass and steppe where acacia and scrub interrupt long views, and seasonal waterways run in courses that later maps forget. The plateau at Giza, in this light, is not a lunar stage, it's a dry island in a quilt of greens and browns, a good place to build if you want height over water and a horizon that speaks with stars. The old world is not simple. The last glacial maximum loosens its grip, and the planet warms, until it doesn't. Just when the thaw seems sure, something snaps cold again. We call it the Younger Dryas, a 1,000-year shiver beginning roughly 12,900 years ago, the climate's hand slapping the table hard enough that you'd notice the change within one human life. Rains shift, plants and animals stumble, people who have begun to settle in for steady seasons are pushed back into motion. In North America, large animals vanish. In the Near East, farming experiments sputter and move. Along the Nile, flood rhythms lurch out of their growing confidence. If you picture a culture on the river's edge then, organizing labor, tracking the sky, building not for a king but for a calendar or a ceremony, picture also the risk, that a cold century arrives and tears up your plans. But before the snap, during a more forgiving window, imagine intent collecting like silt. Communities that return to the same bend in the river each year bring stories and skills with them. They trade in memory. This is where the sun stands at midwinter. This is where the stars rise when the river begins to fatten. This is where the ground stays dry when floods are ambitious. A shared ambition takes root. Not a tomb in the dynastic sense, that needs writing and kingship to frame it, but a platform, a terrace, a place to tilt human time against the celestial. Choose a ridge that will not drown, choose a position that makes sense with the sky at some ceremonial dawn. Giza is an obvious page in that book. High ground, a clean sightline, close enough to the river to drink and move stone, far enough to stay out of trouble when the Nile is swollen by rains from countries you will never see. If you prefer your possibilities cautious, keep them so. This is not a suggestion that the Great Pyramid rose whole under an Ice Age moon. It is a smaller proposition, that building in stone, shaping, placing, aligning, could have begun here in modest forms under a different climate, then suffered, paused, or scattered under the Younger Dryas, then resumed in another key when the planet warmed in earnest and the Sahara turned green for millennia. The African humid period arrives, and rains pour north, making lakes and rivers across North Africa bloom. In that long wet season, stone remembers water in ways we can still read, and logistics grow simpler. Rivers carry weight, fields feed hands, ramps pack well, sledges slide. Then, much later, the green retreats and the desert returns with a will, leaving the biggest bones exposed and burying the rest. It is in that alternation, wet to dry, gathering to dispersing, that a layered Giza stops feeling like a romance and starts reading like climate. A society that learns to lay stone true may not be a state. Organization does not require a crown, it needs rhythm, trust, a reason to show up each season with your shoulders and your time. We have proof from other places and dates that people without kings raise large circles and align them well. We do not need to import those pillars to Egypt to admit the principle. If, in one of the gentler centuries between Ice Age and Arid Age, hands here learned better ways to move and fit blocks, that knowledge could persist as a craft even as the communities that began it changed shape. When kings do arrive with gold names and tall titles and a need to declare themselves at the horizon, they might find not a blank page but an outline, not a solved problem but a good start. The Younger Dryas has a talent for erasing, and not just in the ways we like to dramatize. Water comes in at the wrong time, animals go elsewhere, plant communities remix, people move. Any settlement that sat low in the delta is in danger twice, once as cooler, stormier weather lashes it, and again when the seas, fed by melting ice, creep back into drowned land. The plateau's elevation would have spared only what was already high and heavy. Small buildings, camps, wooden works, mortal things vanish first. Stone on the scale of Giza survives not because the culture that built it is special in story, but because mass and placement defy the usual forces. The monuments we see are the iceberg's tips, the fleet below the waterline is silt and silence. Skeptics have a necessary question: if a pre-dynastic or early Holocene building habit existed here, where are the middens, the cemeteries, the tools and layers we can date? The fair answer is that floodplains and deserts are bad archivists for most of what humans are made of. The Nile rearranges furniture without notice, the sands bury and abrade, later generations tidy with a thoroughness that would make any modern conservator weep. Add reuse to this, old stone made new, faces recut, cores wrapped in fresh skins, and much of the earliest labor vanishes behind later finish. The plateau may still hold hints beneath or beside the obvious lines, but if they do not exist in air, they may exist as negative space, shelves cut into bedrock where ramps once bit, odd alignments that make more sense under an older sky, weathering patterns that speak of exposure when the climate's voice was different. Stand the two pictures side by side instead of letting them fight. In the first, 4th dynasty kings conceive here for the first time at this scale, recruiting, quarrying, casting bureaucracy like a net, aligning stone with stellar purpose, and stamping their names deep enough that we still read them. In the second, those kings arrive at a place already trained to hold weight and meaning, terraces that suggest where and how, a platform worth adopting, perhaps even a silent mass rough cut long before, with edges softened and faces scarred by rain that belonged to another epoch. The kings then do what kings do best, amplify, regularize, crown. They finish the sentence in a script legible to us because it was designed to be legible, temples and causeways, reliefs and rites, a story told in grammar stone understands. The ice and the green and the desert that follow are not background, they are co-authors. Sea levels rise, coastlines swallow towns that would have told us things we do not know, the delta expands and retreats like a breath, the river learns new curves. In this churn, the survivors are almost always the most obstinate materials on the highest ground. It is no accident that Giza looks eternal. It is elevation plus mass plus habit, the luck and intent of builders who chose a shelf that outlived the weather's worst moods. If an earlier impulse inhabited that shelf, if hands before the Pharaohs set any large stone here with a mind to the sky, the younger Dryas may have scattered their households and broken their calendars while leaving their heaviest thoughts intact. This is not a plea to crown a ghost. It is an invitation to let climate into the room where we argue about authorship. The plateau we walk now is the hard, bright end of a long environmental pendulum. You can read its grooves and see wet, you can read its dunes and see dry, you can read its placement and see prudence. When the 4th dynasty turns up with names and temples, they are not writing on air. They are carving on a palimpsest that the planet itself prepared, first with cold, then with rain, then with dust. Keep that sequence in mind as we turn to water's other role in the story. The way a flood does not merely weather stone but resets coastlines, drowns deltas, and stores entire chapters where only diverse and sonars can find them. From ice to sea is a single motion. The next part happens under a surface that reflects the sun too brightly to see through. Begin with a story almost every culture saves for nights when the wind is up and the children are listening, too much water. Not the friendly kind that fattens fields and smooths a river's temper, but water that forgets its margins. In Sumer, a god whispers to Utnapishtim to build a boat before the roar arrives. In a Hebrew valley, a man named Noah measures timber for an ark, counting pairs of hooves and wings. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha ride a chest over peaks that once seemed taller than gods. Egypt's memory is quieter but older feeling, creation as emergence from a limitless flood, the first mound lifting itself out of the waters of none, a god standing where there was only a surface, then naming the world into place. Strip these stories of their robes and what remains is a shiver that runs along the same nerve. Once, the boundaries failed. Geology, which cares nothing for parables, has its own version of the tale and its own dates to mark on a bone. As the great ice sheets lost their grip at the close of the last glaciation, seas rose, slowly in human terms most years, cruelly fast in others. Add the pulses, moments when the rise jerked forward by meters within a century, like a stair the ocean climbed 2 at a time. The most famous of these, Meltwater Pulse 1A, lands around 14,500 years ago, shoving shorelines back in a human lifetime. Add a later story some scientists tell about the Black Sea, freshwater once, then filled from the Mediterranean when the Bosporus opened like a failed dam around 7,500 years ago. The evidence there is still an argument, not a verdict, drowned river valleys mapped by sonar, layers of freshwater shell crushed under saltwater cousins, ancient shorelines traced like scars under silt. But even if you set the Black Sea aside as a contested chapter, the larger book reads the same. The sea does not ask permission. It rearranges maps. Imagine you live where a river fans into a delta that grows fat on generosity. Each year it adds a little land in silt and reed, and each year the sea steals some back. Now imagine the stealing outpaces the gift. Tidal mouths grow teeth. Salt tongues creep inland. A village that sat in the wet green becomes a sandbar a child can wade to in a summer low. Another spends a year as a safe island, then vanishes into a gray that never stills. The Nile's delta today is flat as worry. In a world of seas climbing stair steps, it would have been a stage for disappearances. If an early, skillful people had built there, ceremonial walls in the marshes, wharves on quieter channels, a settlement committed to water, they could be under the Mediterranean now, silted over and asleep. In that scenario, the plateau's height would not just be a convenience, it would be salvation. A place whose biggest shapes are never asked to swim. The universality of flood tales does not prove a single flood. It suggests a pattern of losses strong enough to fossilize in story. In Australia, some Aboriginal communities keep narratives that describe coasts you can only now see with sonar, beaches and headlands drowned more than 7 millennia ago that match the cartography of modern science surprisingly well. Oral memory can measure farther than literate cultures like to believe, it can hold a shoreline's retreat in a song. If such things are possible in one corner of the world, it is not reckless to imagine that priests along a young Nile folded pieces of a salinated memory into their cosmogony, the land rising, the god stepping onto a first dry place, order imposed on praise and panic. Bring the lens back to Egypt's particular habit of water. Long after the age of flood myths and coastlines on the move, pharaohs were still building boats big enough to carry monuments. Reliefs show barges vast and shallow, cedar planks stitched and pegged with the kind of patience we now reserve for watches and satellites. On one such vessel, actual, not carved, an obelisk could ride like a tooth of dawn bound for a temple upriver. Near the Great Pyramid, wood slept in a stone-lined pit for nearly 5,000 years, every plank numbered, every curve intended, ready to be reassembled by modern hands that still smelled the Levant in the cedar as if a shipwright had stepped out for lunch and never returned. These crafts are late in our story compared to any hypothetical early builders, but they reveal a deep comfort with water as partner, not enemy. If earlier centuries had brought more water to more places, the habit would have older roots still, reed and plank solving distance, rafts and barges teaching how to move what is too heavy to dream of carrying. Now stand on the plateau and let the water come in. Not as a wall, not as a movie's hammer, but as a creeping insistence seen over seasons, then decades. You watch fields drown low in the delta, you hear that a town once famous for potters is a shoal now where birds rest on their way across the sea, you learn to measure the river's rise not with a line scratched on a nilometer but with the distances people have to walk to find a dry doorstep. If you had raised heavy stone on higher ground, not as a royal tomb in the Old Kingdom sense but as a place where your community met the sky in ritual, your children might one day climb to it not for ceremony but for refuge. And after the waters settled into their new arithmetic and you came down again to smaller lives along a narrower river, the old upper place would remain, scarred, perhaps, softened, certainly, visible to anyone with eyes and a memory long enough to recognize it as a survivor. This is the kind of image that spooks certainty because it explains too well why some monuments look older than their inscriptions. They are older, at least in part, or they sat in the weather through a cycle that punished stone more than the centuries that followed, or they were patched and taken up by later hands that wrote the names we now know across faces carved by people with no hieroglyph for themselves. You do not need to declare a lost civilization to accept this. You need only be honest about how environments erase, and how cultures reuse and rename what endures. Skeptics step in, and they should, with their best questions sharpened. If flood stories preserve memory, why do they diverge in their details? Because oral tradition is a net with big knots, it catches shapes, not dates. If water ate the delta's archives, why do we not find more sure signs underwater, walls, streets, foundations squared beyond geology? We have found some things, harbors collapsed by quake and subsidence, cities like Thonis Heraclean asleep in mud and salt, anchors and keys and statues dislodged and then preserved by silt. But the deeper, older shelves where a pre-dynastic experiment might hide are hard to search and harder to fund. Sonar maps suggest buried rivers, cores draw up histories in mud. The work is slow and the sea is busy, it rearranges our evidence even as we arrive to collect it. So we live for now with two appropriate humilities. The first is toward story. Do not mistake a myth for a map, but do not treat it as nothing. It is a vessel designed to survive rough water, some of what it carries is memory, and some of it is the ballast of symbol. The second is toward what water can do to stone and the human record. Seas climb steps, deltas alter, rivers trade courses, cities sink in a night when the ground liquefies under their feet, boats sleep a few paces from pyramids because the desert, unlike the sea, sometimes hides to preserve. From this vantage, imagining the pyramids as island things in certain years during the world's long thaw is not a romance, it is a disciplined speculation tied to the physics of melt and the patience of stone. Picture pilgrims in a later age telling a version of the tale without numbers. Once the waters rose above the earth and the gods remade the world, once the land returned and the old high places were the first to stand in the sun. Then picture a king coming here centuries after the flood memory had turned to theology and deciding, as kings do, that this surviving geometry should wear his name and serve as heaven. In that moment, the myth and the monument braid so tightly you can no longer tell whether the story explains the stone or the stone authorizes the story. All you know for certain, in the quiet before the next wind starts, is that water has been both a mason and an editor here. It carved, it erased, it lifted and set down, it kept some chapters for itself and floated others into the hands of priests who wrote with gods. And above the Nile's long conversation with the sea, the plateau still stands, dry-backed and stubborn, bearing whatever inscription the present requires while keeping the weather's older text underneath. We will follow the river inland now, west into a Sahara that was once green, to find other kinds of water, lakes and basins, rivers gone to ghost lines, and other memories cut into stone with the patience of people who watched the sky because it told them when their world would change. Close your eyes and let the Sahara breathe again. Rivers braid across flats where today only wind writes its hieroglyphs. Acacia stands stitched the horizon with pale green, and in the shallow light of morning you can watch hippos knuckle up through a mat of lilies to blow mist at the sun. Herds move like weather. Stone hollows carry bright water and the air is loud with insects that no longer have a word in this language of sand. This is not a fantasy sketched on a museum wall, it is the Sahara's other face, a chapter geologists call the African humid period, millennia when the monsoon reached farther north, when lakes spread like dropped mirrors, and when people roamed and settled where maps now write, empty. You can still read that wet chapter if you know how to tilt the page. From the sky, satellite eyes see ghost rivers and pale fans that curl out of bedrock, the fossil anatomy of watersheds that forgot themselves. On the ground, the old shorelines ring basins and faint scallops, the sand hides and then reveals pebbled beaches, chalky fish bones appear half a day's walk from the nearest modern stream. Rock faces carry another archive, giraffes etched tall as doorways, elephants in single-file processions, crocodiles and hippos in scenes so matter-of-fact you can feel the humidity in the incised line. A few panels show boats, long, raised prow silhouettes gliding across cliffs now hundreds of miles from any coast. Do not oversell the image as proof of fleets on seas where none stood, do not undersell it as decoration. It is evidence that water stood where our eyes refused to see it, and that people moved on it in craft sturdy enough to make memory proud. Follow those memories south into Egypt's western desert and you find a shallow basin studded with stone, Nabta Playa. Here, long before the pharaohs, pastoralists and herders gathered when the seasonal rains deepened a lake into habit. They left alignments, circles and spokes and outlying megaliths set with an attention that looks suspiciously like a calendar. One small ring, in particular, seems to walk its sight lines toward the summer solstice sunrise. There are also cattle burials, animals laid down with care, bones arranged the way hands arrange something more than food, and pottery that tells an old story about people who understood clay, fire, and the value of carrying containers where water does not last. Debate is healthy and alive here. Not everyone agrees on what the stones say, or how precisely they speak of the sky. Some see ritual first and astronomy as an aftertaste, others hear the opposite. But almost no one denies the sophistication of people who tracked seasons with their feet and the sky with their eyes, then wrote both into rock. Think of the desert then as a network, not a barrier. In wet centuries, the green patches are stepping stones rather than islands. Families move with their herds between basins, timing their migrations to rains that keep promises for generations at a time. Trails deepen into habit, habit into exchange. Stone specialists wrap obsidian and chert cores for traveling, bone workers carry needles and awls, potters lift burnished jars into wicker cradles, storytellers bring star names from one fireside to another. By the time you reach the Nile's valley in this era, you find not an isolated ribbon of culture but a confluence, a place where the desert's itinerant knowledge meets the river's calendar. It is easy to picture skills and symbols arriving in bundles, star watching that can mark a solstice, the practical genius of building with unbaked brick and stone in concert, animal rights that see cattle as more than meat, a habit of gathering at marked places to bind a community to its year. Water is generous, then it is not. Between roughly 7,000 and 5,000 years ago the green begins to fade out of the Sahara's skin. Rains retreat like a guest who decides to leave early and never comes back. Lakes shrink from inland seas to ponds, then to dry bowls that collect wind. Grass loses its patience. People read the change first in herds, cattle range farther for less, then in the way wells pull up salt and disappointment. It is not a single disaster that arrives with a bang, it is a reshelving of the world over a few human lifetimes. The map redraws itself from within. Communities that had lived comfortably on the high shoulders of the desert begin to fold into the Nile corridor, where water will not betray them quite so quickly. That tightening is not a collapse so much as a concentration. Think of knowledge compressing as distance shortens. The river valley is a long, fertile hinge, and as more people swing toward it, the hinge begins to carry weight differently. Toolkits diversify to match narrower land, fish weirs and nets, new habits of fieldwork, seasonal camps shedding their impermanence. Stone knowledge does not vaporize just because rain does, it reallocates. A person who once set site stones to watch a solstice can teach a neighbor how to square a wall to a rising star. A group that built cairns and circles on high ground can help choose foundations that keep their dignity under flood. And everywhere the river picks up this inheritance, it tucks it into a tighter weave with clay, grain, and ceremony. If the plateau later feels as if it already knew how to hold perfect lines and heavy mass, part of that knowing may come from centuries of practice moving slowly toward the water. Walk with the migrants in your mind and you can hear the change. Cattle bells quiet, as much symbol as sound, and the word for season starts to mean flood. The old boat figures scratched on rock become actual boats pulled up on muddy banks, their prows tied to tamarisk trunks. The desert routes never go away entirely, they reappear as caravan tracks in later centuries, the dotted lines that bind oasis to oasis. But the green web that once made the Sahara a neighborhood snaps strand by strand, and the Nile becomes the main road. In that concentration, cultures like Badarian and Nakata, names archaeologists use as scaffolding, flower and hybridize along the valley, absorbing the desert's itinerant sky sense and the river's sober arithmetic. By the time royal names harden into titulary, the valley has been practicing together for a very long time. Even as the desert dries, it preserves like a careful archivist when it chooses. The wind lifts sand over rock art and lays it down again. Potsherds wait under a few inches of drift for a boot to scuff them. Hearths freeze into rings of stone that still smell like ash when a trowel cracks them open. What the green era leaves behind is often modest by comparison to later cut stone, perishable architecture and portable belief, but its logic survives in alignments and habits. A ring of megaliths that looks toward a sunrise becomes, a few centuries later, a courtyard whose corners locate north with almost insulting accuracy. A cattle burial by a basin becomes cattle as wealth and offering, then, later still, a goddess who wears horns that cradle a disk of sun. The Green Sahara's most durable gift, perhaps, is an appetite for the sky. In open country, the firmament is not wallpaper, it is a tool. You tell time with it, find your way with it, decide when to move camp and when to stay. A tradition that trains people to read such slow motion can be braided into stone when the chance comes. The Nile's banks are a better classroom for masonry than the deserts, but the curriculum of patience learned on the basins, watch, count, return, compare, slides easily into architecture meant to last. When the Fourth Dynasty arranges three great masses on a plateau and shaves their faces until they flirt with the cardinal points, that act does not fall from a clear sky. It grows out of centuries of bodies turning toward the same horizon and saying, there. Keep, too, the sense of exchange. The Sahara in its green age is not a single culture but a patchwork of neighbors who sometimes share and sometimes quarrel. The river is not a single people but a sequence of local traditions that learn to talk to one another with increasing fluency. When the desert empties toward the Nile, it doesn't pour a single story into a single jar, it delivers many strands that tangle and then slowly align. That is one reason Giza refuses to behave as a clean origin point. Even if no block there predates the Pharaohs, the skills required to raise it did. Those skills were learned under cloud and under stars long before a cartouche ever took a brushstroke. Stand on a dune ridge where the wind has unwrapped a scatter of old shirts. The sun is going down, the air is thin, the world feels almost plausible as two places at once, the green ghost and the gold fact. Somewhere to the east the river is catching the same light and turning it to copper. The people who once passed here are gone. Their art is on cliffs, their wells are sand. But their habits, watch the sky, meet where the year turns, build where the ground stays dry, survive in quiet ways. Follow those habits, and the plateau begins to look less isolated and more inevitable, high ground in a land whose map was once different, a stage chosen by generations who learned to bind sky and water to stone. From here, we will tilt our heads upward. The next questions belong to night, how stones listen to stars, how precession moves the sky under a slow hand, how theories about Orion and Leo find purchase on an ancient plain. The Green Sahara taught people to pay attention, the monuments at Giza suggest they continue to do so with terrifying precision. Let's walk out into the dark and see what the sky was saying when the first alignments were decided. Night on the plateau is not black, it is a soft indigo crisscrossed by slow mathematics. Away from Cairo's glare, the horizon breathes, and Orion's belt lifts itself cleanly out of the dark like three nails driven into sky. The stars are not decoration out here. They are tools and memory and the oldest story anyone ever learned to tell. It is from this night that the most persistent idea about Giza takes its light, that the three great pyramids repeat Orion's three-star belt on the ground, offset just so, as if the builders traced heaven in stone. Robert Bauval gave this intuition its crispest outline in the 1990s, and the notion has proved impossible to forget. Turn the sky back using the slow gear of precession, Earth's axial wobble that shifts the starfield over millennia, and, he argued, you find a moment around 10,500 BCE when the belt's tilt best matches the pyramid's plan and, at spring equinox, Leo rises due east where the Sphinx looks eternally. It is an elegant chord, 3 stars, 3 pyramids, a lion in the sky, a lion on the ground, a date stamped not in ink but in alignment. Elegance is not proof, and the mainstream has been careful. Constellations are our inventions, and patterns are cheap, shift the frame, and the coincidence shifts with it. Surveyors point out that the Giza layout answers to topography and logistics as much as to myth, bedrock ridges, quarry scars, causeways, and the need to bring temples down to the floodplain. The sizes of the pyramids do not map cleanly to the relative brightness of the belt stars. The offset, intriguingly similar though it is, can be read as a practical solution to building on uneven ground. And when you zoom out to include surrounding tombs, quarries, and roads, the plan looks less like a star map and more like a city, organized, yes, but answering to many masters at once. In that reading, the Orion echo becomes a byproduct of choices made for earthly reasons. Between romance and rebuttal lies the sky's slower lesson. Precession is real. Over about 26,000 years, Earth wobbles like a spinning top, so that the celestial pole migrates in a wide circle and star positions at a given season drift. A builder who aligns stone to stars in 2500 BCE is not aligning to the same sky as a builder in 10,500 BCE, even if they share the same horizon. That does not require a lost civilization, it requires patience and good eyes. Egyptians had both. They divided the night into decans, 36 star groups rising at regular intervals, using them as a clock that priests could read with a glance. They noticed the heliacal rising of Sirius at dawn in summer, tied it to the Nile's swelling, and built a calendar sturdy enough to steer agriculture with confidence. A culture that could lay lines to the cardinal points with unnerving accuracy. The Great Pyramid sides face true north, south, east, and west with an error so small it feels impolite to mention in casual company. How, without compasses or lasers? One answer requires only sky and repetition. Pick two bright circumpolar stars, the ones that never set. When one is directly above the other across the pole, the line connecting them briefly marks true north-south. Watch that crossing, mark it with plumb lines, repeat on many nights and season by season, and the average of those moments gives you a meridian finer than any single glance can. Another method uses equal altitude observations. Note where a known star rises and sets at the same height above the horizon, bisect the angle. None of this needs iron or magic. It needs a horizon, time, and a discipline the Nile Valley had in abundance. Then there are the shafts. Deep inside the Great Pyramid, narrow passages climb from the king's chamber and queen's chamber toward the pyramid's skin, kinked and plugged, too small for a person, too straight for accidents. In the 19th century, they were called air shafts, as if ventilation were the point. Later, as engineers mapped their angles, another reading took hold. They were sightlines or symbolic guideways aiming at particular stars, Osiris Orion to the south, Thuban and Draco near the pole to the north from the king's chamber, Sirius to the south, Kochab to the north from the queen's chamber, targets appropriate around 2500 BCE but sliding with precession if you dial the sky backward. It is not unanimity, measurements vary, and interpretations travel with them. But even the sober versions agree that the shafts are not casual. They are decisions the builders hid inside the mass, a geometry with a purpose that is cosmic in feel even if we cannot name it with certainty. All of this, the cardinal accuracy, the decans, the shafts, sets a floor for the argument, even if the ceiling remains in shadow. The floor is that the 4th dynasty was astronomically literate at a level that serves architecture. They could read the sky, choose sightlines, and fix stone accordingly. The ceiling is how far you want to push that literacy into cosmology. Were they writing a theology in masonry, or refining ritual devices, or both? Here the Orion correlation does useful work even for its critics. It insists that we look at the plan not just as three big triangles but as a composition with a relationship to night. It asks whether the builders meant to echo heaven or simply could not help doing so because their practical methods pull the sky into every line. If you walk the site at dusk with those questions in your pocket, you notice how often the practical and the symbolic share a bench. Causeways descend not only where a road must but where processions make sense. Temple axes speak to river and horizon at once. The necropolis blooms around a royal pivot in patterns that are as much social as they are stellar. The Orion idea may over-argue its case, but it is right to assume that for people who watched stars as clocks and gods, the boundary between measurement and meaning was thin. To true a wall to the north was also, in a sense, to face a god. Turn precession's crank, then, as a thought experiment rather than a verdict. Rewind until Leo rises where the Sphinx looks and Orion's belt floats at a tilt that pleases your eye. You have not proved a date, you have made a poetry. The value of that exercise is not that it forces Giza into 10,500 BCE, but that it trains you to see the monuments as participants in a dialogue with the moving sky, not as rock piles indifferent to it. It also reminds you that alignments are perishable. A shaft that points to Thuban as a polar star in 1 century will miss it centuries later. A temple that catches a solstitial beam perfectly when new may drift out of tune in the lifetime of someone whose grandchildren still tend its lamps. The builders knew this and built anyway, accepting that stone is slow and the sky is slower, and that the conversation between them would not always stay in key. The Decans are a comfort here because they show continuity under motion. However the pole wanders, however Orion tilts, the habit of slicing the night into rising markers gives you a stable practice even as the figures change. Priests could tell the hour long after the exact stellar targets had slid away from old shafts. Farmers could watch Sirius return whether or not they remembered the last time it rose to the minute. On nights when the air clears and city light spills only so far, you can almost imagine the old readings performed again on the plateau's edge, a plumb line against the stars, a chant marking a transit, a chalk mark on a stone that will be trimmed back tomorrow to match that patient line. None of this compels you to accept a pre-dynastic blueprint buried inside the pyramid's plan, and none of it requires you to reject the seduction of correspondences out of hand. It is enough, for now, to admit that the builders were not blind to the sky, that true north meant something more than neatness, that narrow shafts were drawn as if the heavens were part of the building's interior, that a belt of 3 stars would have been as familiar to them as the crooked triangle of the delta. Whether they meant to mirror Orion in plan or only to honor him in a hidden line of sight, the result is the same for us standing here. The night around the monuments is noisy with intention. So stay a little after the tour buses have gone and the vendors have packed away their hawks. Wait for Orion to climb. Let your eye hop from belt to pyramid, not to prove anything, but to feel how thin the membrane is between soil and sky on this limestone shelf. Then turn north and find the slow circle around a pole that is no longer Thuban but remembers how to be. The builders did not freeze the heavens. They set their work into a field that moves and trusted that meaning would move with it. In the next step we will come back down into the rock, into fossils like thumbprints of vanished seas and into the stones themselves as time capsules with 2 histories, the Earth's and our own. For tonight, stand with your back to the dark mass and your face to the belt. You are exactly where the builders wanted you, between geometry and myth, measuring with your eyes. Run your fingertips over a block at Giza and you are not just touching a monument, you are touching an ocean. The plateau's limestone is the pressed memory of a shallow sea laid down in the Eocene, when northern Egypt was warm water and light, a shelf where shells rained and beds of limy mud thickened by the patient centimeter. The pyramids are therefore not merely human stone, they are reef stuff, reef time, architecture of fossils. In the right light you can see them, the coiled whorls of ancient snails, the broken lace of corals, the ghosted ribs of creatures too small to name without a lens. A block that now holds a corner once held sunlight in a green world and sifted silt through living fingers. It changes the scale of the place to realize this. The Age of Kings becomes a postscript to a geology that had already edited the land for tens of millions of years. The Great Triangles are stacks of sea. Even the chalk that powders your palm is the scraped dust of plankton skeletons that fell through water no pharaoh ever saw. The builders quarried locally because that is what builders do, but local here means a quarry in time as much as in space. They cut their architecture out of an ocean's graveyard and then stood it up against the sky. The stone tells on itself. The Giza Formation is not a single, even page, it is layered prose, hard beds tight with cement and fossil grit, softer beds chalky and more easily bruised. That is why the Sphinx enclosure wears shelves and recesses like stripes, why some blocks keep their edge and others surrender to powder under a thumb. In places the fossils crowd so thickly that a sawn face looks like a dish of shells set in mortar. Elsewhere, long calcite veins run through like pale scars, proof that water has visited and deposited its own handwriting in cracks opened by strain or shrinkage long after the seafloor rose into air. Walk west into the desert far beyond the plateau and the sea speaks louder. At Wadi al-Haytham, Valley of the Whales, the wind uncovers vertebrae the size of stools and skulls shaped like living torpedoes. These Eocene whales carry vestigial hind limbs, small, jointed legs halfway between a swimmer's wish and an engineer's shrug. They do not belong to our story of Giza's making directly, but they anchor the setting. The same slow lifting and tilting that raised those bones out of a dead sea also birthed the limestone that became the pyramids. The builders worked within a geology that arrives with the calm of plate tectonics and leaves with the stubbornness of stone. Fossils aren't just decoration in this tale, they are diagnostic. A mason's eye might learn, over time, which beds ring under a hammer and which crumble, which carry shells so densely they break in predictable chips and which contain tougher nodules that fight a chisel. You can almost see the learning curve etched into the quarries at the plateau's edge, testing cuts along a bedding plane, a face abandoned where the texture turned treacherous, a run of blocks stolen from a layer whose character proved perfect for the job at hand. The pyramid's geometry is precise, but its sourcing is pragmatic to the grain. Not every limestone block at Giza reads the same sentence. Petrographers who thin-sliced the rock and read it with light have noted variations that hint at subtler sourcing, slightly different microfossil assemblies, variations in cement, textures that don't match the beds immediately underfoot. The conservative reading is layer hopping, different floors within the local formation, each with its own fossil recipe and mechanical behavior. The bolder reading allows for something else as well, that some limestone, particularly in cores, might have been resourced or reused, borrowed from older structures or hauled from nearby outcrops when a particular quality was needed. In that case, a block becomes a double-time capsule, first an ocean's deposit, then a cultural transplant, carrying two histories in one weight. Stone keeps weather like skin keeps freckles. When the desert scrubs a surface or rain briefly darkens it, new fossils appear as if memory has been revealed from beneath a scab. In places the weathering reads like a palimpsest, freshly broken shell eyes look out from under the softened rind, and you understand how the plateau can seem to change age with the light. The stone is always both very young where a face was newly dressed and very old in what that face is made of. A single block can be two clocks at once. There is chemistry in this story, too, even in places we do not often think to look. The mortar that fixes many joints at Giza is a desert recipe, gypsum and lime, occasional grit, whose microworld can trap accidental debris, flecks of charcoal, wind-blown plant bits, the occasional fragment that might one day offer a date if contamination can be ruled out. But even below that scale, the limestone holds geochemical whispers that tell of the sea that made it, the ratios of certain isotopes, the trace elements that ride in on the bodies of marine organisms or the waters that percolated later through pores. No single test turns the pyramid into a lab report, it is the accumulation of clues, geological first and cultural second, that turns stone into narrative. Reuse complicates everything, as reuse always does. If later builders broke older limestone to make new casing, the fossil faces in those recut blocks would be the same sea in a second life. If a block once stood in the weather and later found itself buried deep in a wall, the skin it shows today may be the preserved interior of a stone that once saw rain. In either case, the fossil record is mute about human policy. It says only, I was a seabed, I was cut, I moved, I was dressed, I stood in this place thereafter. The chisel marks are the human grammar laid across that unhuman text. There's a practical beauty in the idea that the builders learned to talk with this stone as a living material, not as an abstract ideal. Limestone is kind to copper compared to granite. It can be coaxed into planes and edges if you understand where its bedding runs and how its shells are stacked. The genius of the Great Pyramid's casing, now mostly gone, was to pair that stone's workability with an ambition for polish a sea creature never grew to provide. Look at the few surviving casing stones and you will see what the language of fossil mud can be made to say under a tool held long enough, a face so true it catches the sun like water. At certain corners of the plateau, this double biography, ocean first, then culture, bends the mind. You imagine a block in 3 lives. In the first, a rain of shells and the quiet chemistry of burial. In the second, men singing in cadence as they lever an ashlar into place with a sledge that hisses on wet sand. In the third, tourists brushing it with their hands as if touch could cancel distance. The first life is longer than the other two by a scale that refuses metaphor. And yet it is the second that gives the stone a chance at the third, because a reef turned into a wall lasts differently than a reef turned into soil. If some limestone at Giza was borrowed, from another site, from an older platform, from a structure taken down to make this one stand, the block's 2 clocks multiply. Think of it as a palimpsest in cross-section. The fossil record says, Eocene. The weathering on a face might say, this surface saw rain in a greener Egypt. The sharpness of a tool mark could say, this edge was trued in an age of kings. A later patch at the corner might say, this was kept alive when damage came. Geology gives the base layer of time, craftsmanship writes the edits, maintenance adds the margin notes. It is tempting, standing in front of this sea-made mountain, to reach for romance, that the ocean placed its own signature under human ambition so the monument could claim eternity twice over. Better to keep the poetry but trim the certainty. What we can say is that the builders worked with a material whose past dwarfs their own, and that they learned to exploit its moods, its bedded weakness and shell-bright strengths, with an intimacy that made geometry possible in a brittle medium. They built a horizon out of former seabed and then aimed it at the sky, a vertical arrangement of worlds that forces anyone who listens to time to keep two clocks running at once. There is a humbling symmetry in that. The pyramids point outward at constellations that move slowly, and inward at fossils that do not move at all. Between sky motion and sea memory, the human story takes its place, thin in duration, astonishing in intent. When you leave the plateau with dust on your shoes, you carry home a little of that ocean in the fold of your trouser cuff. It is not a souvenir, it is a reminder that building in stone always entails a pact with deeper time. The sand will try to take the blocks back, the wind will speak in the old grammar of abrasion, rare rains will rewrite surfaces in the same cursive they used on the Sphinx's walls. But underneath, the shells remain, stubborn and serene, patient as only a sea can be when it has turned to rock. From seabed to skyline, then. In the next turn we will go where the sea ate the record directly, into the drowned shelves of the delta and along submerged riverbeds where a different archive waits under silt. Here on the high ground, the ocean speaks through fossils trapped in stone. There, beneath the green water, it speaks through absence, and, sometimes, through cities asleep. Stand on the seawall at Alexandria and watch the Mediterranean breathe, a long, slow heave against stone that remembers other streets. Out in the haze, fishing lights bob like notes on a staff. Under the surface, a city sleeps in clauses, columns fallen like commas, doorways collapsed into ellipses, courtyards resting in a grammar of silt. Divers tell of thresholds you can still step through in imagination, of statues face down in a pail that moves when the tide stirs, of anchors nested among amphorae as if the ship's only just unmoored. The water is green and thick with centuries. The sea, an editor with no deadline, took its time striking out whole paragraphs here. Coastlines do not stand still in Egypt. The Nile builds and unbuilds the delta the way a child reworks a sandcastle between waves. Each year the river carries silt, brown, fine, endless, and spreads it in fans that shift their mouths from century to century. Land grows like fingernails, then breaks. Meanwhile, the ground remembers that it is made of soft things, mud, sand, old lagoons. It settles, subsides, breathes downward with the weight of its own history. Add a world in the midst of its long melt, seas inching up steps, sometimes two at a time, and you have a recipe for disappearance. A town can die in a storm or in a sigh. It can tilt during an earthquake, the sandy underlayer liquefying under the rhythm of waves, and never right itself again. Afterward, the river arrives with silt like a blanket and tucks the ruin in. When people speak of lost Egypts, they tend to look east, to deserts that bury. But the sea is just as good at concealment when the timing is right. A harbor collapses, a quay slides, a temple wades out into deeper water, and then the Nile helps, one flood at a time, laying down a layer cake that hides edges and softens outlines. Centuries later, divers brush away silt with their palms and confront faces, granite with a smile too formal for this new kingdom of fish, kings who never imagined they'd one day look up through a column of green. Heraclean, Thonis, to the locals, was a port of consequence once, a mouth where pharaohs and merchants negotiated with sea and tax. For more than 1,000 years it lay where maps pretended there was only water, its steels and docks sunk not by myth but by geology and a certain indifference in the way river and sea share a shoreline. Maps now show other ghosts. Sonar sketches riverbeds that no longer exist in air, paleochannels braiding under the shelf like the veins on the back of a hand. Drill cores lift out stories the eye cannot gather, layers of river mud, shells from a lagoon that no longer breathes, sand scorched by an old shoreline wind, then, abruptly, the kind of silt that loves to bury walls. When you imagine a pre-dynastic delta, you must imagine it with these moving parts, channels that shift, lagoons that wink open, then shut, marsh islands that support life for a few hundred years and then fail. It is neither romantic nor rash to say that if people built ambitiously here before the pharaohs, the sea and the river had every opportunity to eat their paper trail and stack quiet sediments over whatever stone survived. The counterargument is tidy and deserves its turn. The sea is a grinder, waves crack what they find, salt needs joints apart. True, on exposed coasts, stone loses fights it would win in air. But burial changes the rules. Put a wall under a few meters of mud that does not often stir, and it can keep its corner for a very long time. Harbors do this, wharves collapse when the ground slips, then vanish beneath the silt that pours in afterward, preserved by the very stuff that ended them. Shipwrecks prove the principle at smaller scales. Wood that should have fed the sea is, under anaerobic blankets, intact enough to count pegs and red tool marks centuries later. Stone is kinder still to the future when smothered fast. What does this have to do with Giza? Everything and a particular kind of nothing. Everything, because the delta's appetite explains why the river's mouth does not give us an easy prologue to the monuments upriver. If a culture along the lowland edge experimented with stone in ceremonial ways, aligning platforms to a solstice, setting up markers along channels, building in brick and limestone where water was a daily condition, those experiments may lie under the silt and salt of a shelf that keeps its secrets well. It is the kind of erasure that trains humility. A lack of ruins and scuba lights is not proof that nothing stood. It may be proof that we are early in a kind of archaeology that is expensive, slow, and hard to do where modern ships cut deep tracks in the same water. And nothing, because Giza does not need the drowned cities to be what it is. The plateau is an inland outlier, a ledge that refused to move when the delta rehearsed its changes. Elevation plus mass creates a survivor's bias so strong it feels like destiny. If you wanted to build something that would outlast your grandchildren's sense of where the shore is, you would choose high ground and make it heavy. The pyramids are both. They stand not because their makers were the only ones to try, but because they sat where the river could not easily unright them and the sea could not hear them. In that sense, the delta's drownings explain the emptiness around Giza on our timeline as much as they threaten to fill it. What survives in air is a skewed sample, the tops of a mountain range whose lower slopes are buried in mud. Consider a thought experiment and keep it modest. Imagine a delta when sea level sits a little lower and the river branches a little farther north. On a stable braid between marsh and lagoon, people set stones in a pattern that helps them tell time, a causeway of brick with a limestone heart, a small platform that greets a particular dawn. For a few centuries it works. Then the channel shifts, the ground sours with salt, storms come. An earthquake rolls through one winter and the sand beneath liquefies under a rhythm of waves, the platform tilts and cracks, the causeway fails in sections. The next flood fills the wound with silt. By spring, what remains is a shoal where birds rest. A century passes and the place is gone to any eye but the one that reads mud. Meanwhile, on the high shelf upriver, a smaller project survives the same years better, nothing grand, but durable. 2 centuries later, when different hands come to build wildly larger, they find this durable outline useful, or at least instructive. None of this obliges you to grant Ice Age pyramids to the sea. It asks only that you admit how thoroughly rivers and shorelines can hide their practice runs. It also proposes a motive for later kings that feels human. In a landscape where water regularly deletes, a monument on the shelf is an argument with the eraser itself. The causeways that march down toward the floodplain read differently when you remember how often that floodplain has changed tense. Valley temples become not just thresholds but bets, that processions will always meet water at roughly this place, that the river will keep its side of an unwritten contract. There is another humility to keep. What the sea reveals depends on what we ask and how long we can afford to ask it. Sonar finds lines, magnetometers find disturbances, divers find corners. But the delta is broad, the shelf is layered with modern detritus, the water is murky with life and the Nile's eternal dust. Heraclean surfaced in our century not because it was the only city to sink, but because a particular team followed a particular hunch with an unusual patience. If there is older work asleep farther out, it may take a different hunch and another kind of patience to hear it turn in its sleep. For now, let the drowned cities perform a quieter service. They remind us that absence is often engineered by physics, not by history's stinginess. They show how easily stone loses a vote when ground and water make common cause. They teach us to be careful when we build a story out of what we can stand beside and point to. And they frame Giza not as a miracle isolated from context, but as a high note still audible because the lower notes were muffled. The plateau's chorus carries precisely because so much of the delta's song is written in a key we cannot hear from shore. Look out again at the line where green water meets the sky. The sun lowers, the color goes steel. Somewhere under that quiet is a harbor's edge, a quay's right angle, a god's face laid down into sleep. Somewhere under that quiet there may be older, humbler shapes, platforms that caught a rising star, walls that met a ceremonial dawn. Whether or not we find them in our time, we know the sea had every chance to file them away. Giza's endurance becomes, in that light, not an argument about who knew what when, but a fact about where knowledge chose to stand. Next, we will step back from shore and look at the trap the written word lays for us, the way a first inscription pretends to be a first act, and how the absence of script makes early chapters look unwritten when they are only unpreserved. We like to pretend that history begins when someone writes it down. It feels clean, the first line of hieroglyphs cut into cool stone, a king's name inked in black, a date a curator can type. In Egypt, that moment gets a ceremonial bow around 3100 BCE, when Narmer's name bites into palate and memory, when Upper and Lower Egypt marry into a single emblem and scribes begin their long love affair with reed and pigment. The illusion that follows is irresistible, before the script, a fog, after the script, a world. But fog is not emptiness. It is weather. Whole civilizations can stand inside it, speak, build, and vanish before the first clear sentence is carved. The trap is simple and deep. Writing, by its nature, survives where other things fail. Shards of pottery take ink well. Stone rewards a chisel with millennia of legibility. Clay tablets, baked by accident in warehouse fires, end up as the hard drives of antiquity. So when we sort the record, the written rises to the top like oil on water and convinces us it is the water. Egypt's hieroglyphs arrive early and almost fully dressed, logograms and phonetic signs and determinatives, an elegant system that looks less like a first draft than a classic reprint. Sumer's cuneiform performs a similar trick in Mesopotamia. What we have are lists that read like minutes from a meeting that began offstage. One of the oldest is not an epic or a law, but something mundane and perfect, quantities of beer and bread, animals and grain. The bureaucratic pulse gets saved. The songs and seasons that train the hands to write them are mostly gone. Once you notice this bias, your picture of beginnings warps in the right way. A script that appears, suddenly, at Giza-level sophistication must have grown in shadows first, scratched marks for counting, emblematic doodles that stabilized into signs, a donor's name cut beside a small shrine and then cut again, cleaner, because the first looked like a child's. It's not an argument from romance, it's an argument from craft. No one births a full script on a Tuesday. They accrue it slowly, practicing on perishable media, wood, skin, plaster, until one day the stone receives the final form and pretends that's where it started. Our museums, lined with the survivors, play accomplice. We build timelines from what can be shelved. This is where oral tradition re-enters, not as a storybook's comfort, but as a technology. In societies without letters, memory is engineered. Repetition, rhythm, formula, these are tools as robust as any chisel. A floodplain culture teaches its calendar as song, a star lore becomes a string of images passed from mouth to mouth, a foundation tale gets recited at the same place each year until the place and the story glue tight. Such systems can carry remarkably far. Elsewhere on the planet, there are examples of coastlines remembered into myth and then matched by modern maps, narratives that clearly stabilized over thousands of years. If that is possible there, it is possible along the Nile. The priests who later recited creation from the waters of Nun may have been wearing theology over a far older memory, a land that rose out of flood, season by season, century by century, until, first hill, became a god and not a geology. Written words also set traps of authority. Once a king's name is painted or cut on a block, the block becomes his in the eyes of later readers, even if the stone had a past life. We saw this with those brushed red marks tucked over chambers few eyes will ever see. We see it again wherever a later inscription pins an origin like a butterfly. I made this, says the text, and the stone nods because stones are polite to power. But writing claims are often editorials, not beginnings. In a palimpsest landscape, where reuse is the rule, names are inheritances as often as they are signatures. The confidence these claims exude is political, their truth in time is more conditional. The earliest surviving mention of a monument usually wins the author credit by default. That is not a conspiracy, it is a filing error built into the archive. This is why folk memory clings to the edges even in the literate age. When Napoleon's scholars walked the shadow of Giza and tried to pin the plateau to catalogue cards, they also wrote down local traditions that said the pyramid stood before a world-drowning flood. To academic ears trained in chronology, such talk sounded like nostalgia with a theological sheen. It still does. Yet that offhand claim holds a sliver of sense. Even within Egypt's own story of divine kingship, the monuments sometimes appear as inheritances from a hazier age, works of the followers of Horus, of god-kings, of giants who belonged to myth because history had lost the vocabulary to describe them without poetry. We need not take the giants literally to hear the point. If skill outlives names, the ancients did what we do, they filled proper nouns with reverent fog. The suddenness of Egypt's achievements in the textbooks, the way the scene seems to cut from mud-brick villages to the most exacting stonework on the planet, is partly an artifact of this bias. We can find Old Kingdom delivery receipts, we can find leveled courses, we can find casing stones that make daylight look like a trick. What we cannot easily find are the drafts. Perishable experiments have perished. Smaller stonework may be buried under suburban sprawl or river mud. Early hints carved into lowland environments may lie under the Mediterranean, where archaeologists move in silt and time at the speed of a diver's breath. When we say, no evidence exists for earlier monumental building, we should append a footnote, in places we can currently see. That is not license to invent lost ages whole cloth. It is a posture of caution aimed at ourselves. Once you get comfortable with that, once you stop expecting a neat-on switch, the Giza story gets larger, not fuzzier. The kings who wrote on stone were not solitary magicians with a flash of inspiration. They were culmination makers and editors-in-chief, inheritors of sky literacy from a greener Sahara and river habit from a long braid of local cultures, funneling skills into scale. The bureaucracy that nourished their projects did not materialize because a scribe invented a bird sign for A. It coalesced because seasons had been rehearsed long enough in memory to need a ledger. When a shipment of stone arrived and someone took a reed pen to assured to note rations and crews, that scribble sat on top of centuries of unscribed logistics. There is a quieter danger in the written record, too. It flattens human experience toward the official. What do we have by sheer survival? King lists. Tax accounts. Foundation texts. Temple hymns. These are the documents of the literate elite, the paperwork of power. They crystallize a narrative in which monuments are always tombs, kings always initiators, religion always the stated motive. What we miss is everything soft, rumors that a platform stood here before, the mason's comment about the quality of a certain quarry layer, the story old women told in the shade about a time when clouds came more often and the Sphinx's enclosure filled with a little lake. In a vacuum, official words overperform. They define categories because we let them. They invite us to confuse a function declared with a function lived. None of this asks you to distrust writing. It asks you to reduce its volume a notch and listen for the other channels, stone's own grammar of bedding and weather, place names that resist translation and might be fossils of older tongues, the logistics of how you feed 10,000 people in a season without a fatal mistake. Once you let those sounds in, the lockstep of first writing, then civilization, breaks. The Nile's earliest states did not arise because someone invented a new icon. They formalized what bodies and minds had already solved together, aligned to the cardinal points using stars, move heavy things with water and patience, meet at the same marked places at the same marked times, keep your dead close to your horizon. Of course the pharaohs carved their certainty into walls. They were selling a story that worked. But when you stand beneath those carved assertions and look past them, you find a deeper comfort. Civilization does not require writing to become itself. Writing is a lens that lets certain parts come into focus. It is also a blindfold tied over others. It gives us a timeline, then hides the drafts that made it possible. The trick is not to throw the lens away, but to peek under the cloth while we use it. So when you return to Giza in your mind, with its precise faces and interior shafts aimed like questions at the sky, hold two things together. First, the names we have matter, the dates we have are real, the institutions we can see were great organizers of stone and people. Second, the neatness of their story is an aftereffect of what survived. Before the first hieroglyph cast its shadow on limestone, builders stood in this wind, looked north by stars, and decided what straight meant. You can feel their hands in the blocks even where no name clings. You can hear their method in joints that whisper, in repairs that confess. Writing will claim the last word, because that is its talent. But here, where the stones are older than any sentence, the first word belongs to the materials and the sky. From this vantage, nothing about the possibility of inheritance at Giza requires miracle, only modesty, the acceptance that texts are latecomers and that memory in stone is older than the stories it inspired. We will let that modesty guide us next into the realm where myth inflates the builders into godlings and giants, a language cultures use when craftsmanship outlives the craftsman's name. There, too, we'll keep the story honest by reading what the hands actually did. In the oldest lists Egypt kept, the ones that pretend to count back before counting was a habit, the first rulers are not men but presences. The Palermo stone reads like a memory hallucinating itself into order, reigns measured in centuries, then thousands of years, god-kings, and their attendants reigning across a time so elastic it stops behaving like time. After them come the Shemsuhor, the followers of Horus, names that sound less like individuals than like a title passed forward by those who walked in the falcon's shadow. To later priests, these lines stitched a divine prologue to the human story. To us, with our fussy timelines and our allergy to immensities, they feel like myth because they are myth. But myth is not the opposite of history, it is what history becomes when the proper nouns dissolve and only the outline remains. Stand on the plateau with that outline in mind and the language of giants starts to make a certain sense. Not literal shoulder-high men lifting lintels the size of houses, but makers whose skill and intent towered above those who later inherited the work. To a mason stepping into an existing complex centuries after its first cuts, a flawlessly true granite face could feel like godcraft, not because it was magic, but because the knowledge chain that made it had thinned or snapped. You attribute divinity to what you cannot reproduce without pain. Giants becomes a metaphor for an earlier peak. Followers of Horus becomes a way to mark a tradition whose names have washed away. Egyptians were not shy about such metaphors. They used them to stitch gaps. When a later king recarved a statue, the face that emerged became the timeline. When a temple absorbed an older shrine, the older god was folded into the new rites as if he had always worn the same headdress. The followers of Horus live in that logic. They are the shadow people who made the first line straight, the anonymous hands whose methods were explained upward into theology. In a land where order, Ma'at, was the supreme good, the most reverent thing you could say about ancient skill was that it prefigured the gods' order and therefore came from them. You can hear the same impulse in other places where stone outlasts its makers. The Romans dragged obelisks to their squares and called them trophies, their inscriptions still shouting the names of Egyptian kings across new empires as if the stones had joined a second life without protest. Medieval builders set their cathedrals on Roman foundations and spoke of the ancients as giants because the arches they left behind felt like ribs from a larger animal. In each case, myth blooms in the cracks of knowledge. The distance between, we can do this, and, we no longer know how, is measured in 1 or 2 lifetimes. Once the old routine is broken, once the master dies without an apprentice to carry the trick, the work he left starts to glow. The plateau's variability underlines this. Not every joint on the site is miraculous, not every seam is a whisper. Some blocks admit the haste of a deadline or the fatigue of hands. But then you turn a corner and meet a fit so delicate your fingernail finds no purchase, or a polish that reflects your skin in the shade, and you understand how later ages found it easier to imagine larger beings than to grant ordinary men this long patience. Technological memory is lumpy. It keeps its peaks, loses its paths, and invites reverence where the slope is steepest. The stories that sprang up around Giza reflect this lumpy memory. Later Egyptian texts sometimes credit the great works to semi-divine predecessors or to legendary sages who brought arts from the gods. In Greek and Roman retellings, the architecture is often folded into a rhetoric of wonder, the works of the ancients, a phrase that can mean, beyond our practical imitation. Medieval and early modern travelers layered their own marvels on top, tunnels rumored to run under the Nile, secret chambers stuffed with tablets no one had read since the flood. What these tales share is not detail but stance, the sense that the plateau belonged to a knowing that had thinned by the time the storyteller arrived. Meanwhile, the stones themselves refuse either romance or dismissal. They do not prove a race of literal giants, they do not yield to the insult that everything here is simple once you've seen the right experiment. The granite beams above the king's chamber are not magic, but they also are not trivial. The shafts that aim at stars are not iron pipes, but they also are not ventilation afterthoughts. The lion body in the bedrock is not a natural curiosity that happened to look like a creature, it is a choice reclaimed across repairs that learn from weather and from worship. In that stubborn in-between, myth and method shake hands. A later priest who says, followers of Horus, may be pointing, in the only language he trusts, at the continuity he feels under his feet, the sense that he is officiating in a space founded by older competence. Think for a moment about how competence travels. Techniques live in wrists and eyes, in a dozen tacit decisions made without speech at the right moment in the work. They are notoriously bad at surviving policy changes. A shift in royal taste, a new quarry opened, a famine that interrupts supply, any of these can thin a craft lineage. If a generation or two leave the stones for mud brick because budgets or beliefs have drifted, the small efficiencies, the angle you hold a chisel so a limestone shell doesn't pop out and crater a face, the amount of sand you add to a slurry to get a cleaner groove in granite, go quiet. They can be rediscovered, but rediscovery feels like deciphering a language you should have grown up speaking. Myths of god kings and long-lived first rulers offer a social technology for that rediscovery. They keep the idea of a highest standard alive by turning it into a person. Our ancestors worked with divine measure, says the story, so you should, too. The first men lived under Horus, says the list, so your alignments had better respect his sky. The names in the Palermo stone are less a chronology than a contract, treat the work as sacred, and maybe your hands will learn again what the older hands knew. In that way, myth polices quality across centuries. It does not tell you which abrasive to choose, it tells you not to stop until the face shines like a god's cheek. The language of giants also performs a second service, it explains reuse without shame. If a king inherits a platform, if he recases a mass, if he fits his cult temple to an older line, the claim that he is working in the line of the followers of Horus turns practicality into piety. He is not economizing, he is participating. He is not borrowing, he is continuing. The palimpsest becomes a virtue when the old layer is divine. That logic matches what we see in stone, places where new skin covers old bone, places where a face has been recarved and recarved again until the last sovereign's features sit on a skull set out by unknown hands. A myth that says, the gods built first is, among other things, a building permit for posterity. It is tempting, from our century, to do what we accuse the ancients of doing, to lean too hard on a single story because it pleases us. Skeptics are right to say that myths cannot date a monument. Believers are right to say that myths can preserve a contour of truth. The fertile space is where the two meet, where we read poetic claims as acknowledgments that cultural memory felt a discontinuity between makers and maintainers, and as evidence that later Egyptians saw themselves as stewards of a landscape they had not wholly initiated. That sense, custodianship of something older, does not move stones back to the Ice Age by itself, but it does soften the certainty that everything began when a royal name said it did. Imagine, finally, a mason in the 4th dynasty, tired at dusk, walking past a block set by someone he never met. He passes his hand over its face and feels the unpleasant truth that today's work did not reach this standard. He mutters a promise to himself in the language of his time, that tomorrow he will work as the followers of Horus worked, meaning not that he believes in literal pre-human giants but that he refuses to shame the line of hands he stands inside. That vow floats for thousands of evenings across the plateau. It survives changes in theology, in kings, in floods. In the end, what reaches us is less the story of giants than the discipline the story preserved. The stones, for their part, do not care whether we imagine godlings here. They carry the same weight either way. But reading the myths with generosity allows us to see what the builders were trying to defend, a standard so high it felt safer to attribute it upward than to risk watching it decay downward. In that light, giants are us at our best, remembered from a distance. And the followers of Horus are the long line of hands, signed and unsigned, who chose to belong to that best and left us work that still shames our laziness when we stand in its shadow. From here, the story will tilt toward an even riskier idea, the thought that a monument can be more than a tomb, that geometry and stone can be tuned to behave like an instrument. We will carry skepticism like a level into that room. But we will also carry the old vow, work as if the hands before you were watching. Walk into the Great Pyramid and the air forgets how to move. Stone swallows sound, your breath becomes the loudest thing you own. The Grand Gallery climbs away from you like a canyon someone convinced to stand indoors, steep floor, corbelled walls, a runnel of darkness that leads your gaze up and up until it runs out of bravery. It is one of those spaces that feels overbuilt for the task the textbook assigns it. If all you need is a corridor, why raise a throat big enough to sing through? Why shape it like a horn? This is where the most beguiling and controversial idea on the plateau catches its echo, that the pyramid is not only a tomb or a mountain of symbolism, but an instrument. Not a machine with gears and pistons, but a structure tuned to behavior, vibration, resonance, a conversation between stone and air and earth that the builders either knew by craft or discovered by accident and decided to use. The power versions of the hypothesis go farther, dreaming of energy harnessed and distributed, of granite and limestone acting together like some vast geological battery. Those claims stumble over the absence of pipes and wires and the lack of artifacts that would need such power. But if you dial the appetite for certainty down and keep the part of the idea that simply says, this place behaves strangely, it becomes harder to dismiss. Start with what your body knows. In the king's chamber, a granite box set deep in the mass, sound does not die the way it should. Certain notes linger and bloom, others damp down so fast you feel rebuked. Sing a low pitch and you can feel, as much as hear, the room answer at around 100 and something cycles per second, a standing wave that seems to reach through your ribs. Musicians and engineers who have snuck a tuning fork or a hum into the chamber report the same odd sensation, that the granite, with its quartz crystals and stubborn density, returns the favor of any tone close to its appetite. There is plain physics under the wonder. Confined volumes have natural frequencies, hard, parallel surfaces encourage waves to bounce and reinforce, even the dimensions of a box can pick a note. Whether the builders pursued this deliberately is the question. The possibility that they stumbled on a behavior while solving other problems and then learned to court it does not strain belief. The pyramid holds other puzzles that feel like parts of the same conversation. In the queen's chamber, low in the structure, two narrow shafts angle upward and away, too small for a person, too straight for accident. They run until they stop at tiny limestone doors set with copper fittings like the ghost of a handle, a detail so odd that the first robot to peer at one in the 1990s became famous for looking at a blockage rather than a passage. Higher still, above the king's chamber, a stack of so-called relieving spaces, flat-roofed compartments built to spread weight, forms a granite sandwich that some interpret as structural good sense and others as an array with a secondary temperament, a way to tune how the mass responds to the tremble of the earth. Even the Grand Gallery's shape, with its narrowing walls and polished sloping floor, has been drafted into arguments about acoustics, about how bodies moving in steps might have pumped air, how wood beams might once have sat in those slots lining the walls to stage a process no longer visible. Then there is the void. In 2017, teams using muon radiography, particle tracks from cosmic rays ghosting through stone like X-rays through flesh, reported a space above the Grand Gallery at least 30 meters long. No staircase leads to it, no known corridor nods in its direction. It is simply there, a silence inside the mass. The careful reading calls it a relieving cavity, an intentional blank designed to keep weight from crushing the great step throat below. The adventurous reading wonders whether such a volume, in such a place, is part of the pyramid's hidden behavior, a balance wheel in a stone clock we do not know how to wind. Either way, the discovery says what the plateau always says when you grow too certain: there is more inside than the plan in your head admits. Some see in these facts the outline of a system. Granite contains quartz. Quartz exhibits the piezoelectric effect when stressed. Vibrate granite enough and you can, under lab conditions, coax tiny charges to gather. Pair that with limestone's insulating properties, with shafts that look like channels, with a geometry aligned so neatly to the planet's axis that it seems meant to catch something from the sky or the ground, and you have the poet's version of a power plant. It is a heady story, and it borrows sheen from names like Tesla, who dreamed in frequencies and wireless light. The trouble isn't physics so much as scale and motive. If the pyramid were built to light cities or drive tools, where are the lamps and the tools that demand it? If energy was the point, why hide the access to the one big void we have found? And if the system worked, why did no later age in Egypt, with all its practical genius for copying what worked, reuse the trick? Strip the fantasy layer away and a more modest, and more plausible, instrument remains. Religion in Egypt is a sensorium. Temples frame light at solstice dawn so that a beam walks the floor to a god. Bark shrines are carried in processions that thicken the air with drum and chant. Perfume, color, the choreography of priests, these are technologies as surely as ramps and sledges. In that context, a chamber that answers certain notes is not an accident, it is a liturgy. A corridor that amplifies footfalls and chant is a choice. A tiny shaft that points, a little imperfectly, but tellingly, at a star associated with a god is not ventilation. It is a line drawn through stone so that the invisible has a place to travel. Even the catalogue of claimed encodings, ratios in the pyramid's dimensions that seem to flirt with pi or with the golden section, can be read in this gentler key. Builders trying to make a stable, beautiful form with integer-based measures and ropes are going to land on certain proportions again and again because those proportions simply work. The fact that a talented mind can find elegant mathematics in a triangle does not require that a scribe wrote the equation in his hut. It may only mean that the builders, working by eye and rule and plumb, came close enough to something profound that the closeness feels like design. That is not a demotion, it is a compliment of a higher sort. Return to the Grand Gallery. Imagine a procession climbing it, torches guttering, drums at a tempo that makes the walls quietly agree, a chant that finds the room's favored pitch without anyone needing to name it. Above, hidden spaces keep the mass honest. Below, the chamber of granite waits with a tone it will sing back if you can find the note. Whether you call this a machine or a ritual architecture depends on what you think the builders were trying to do with their dead. Tomb and instrument are not enemies. A place that confirms a king's divinity might be expected to behave like more than a hallway. Skepticism is the ballast that keeps the boat from capsizing. The pyramid does not hum like a generator, it does not throw lightning from its capstone, there is no burnt residue of ancient bulbs. The most we can say with our hands on the stone is that certain rooms favor certain frequencies, that narrow shafts seem to attend to certain stars, that hidden volumes exist where weight and behavior insist on them, and that the overall geometry respects the earth in a way that goes beyond what a mere pile of blocks requires. Whether that adds up to a theory is less interesting than the way it invites us to pay better attention. If we listen that way, scientifically, patiently, a little in love, we might yet learn something ordinary and astonishing. That a culture without steel perfected an acoustic comfort in granite because people who live in ritual notice sound. That a corridor becomes a horn not because someone did calculus but because 1,000 feet knew which curve made the chant feel like a god arriving. That a void is where it is because the structure needs breath there, the way a chest does. Such conclusions do not disappoint. They humanize a wonder that too often floats away on speculation. They return the monument to people who observed, tested, and remembered at a scale that embarrasses our appetite for shortcuts. From here, it is a small step down the slope to the places our eyes don't often go, into the unexcavated sands at the plateau's margin, into suburbs that sit atop ancient capitals, into boat pits we missed a few paces from a tourist path for half a century. If the pyramid is an instrument, then the country around it is a library of sheet music with most of its pages still stuck together. The next questions are practical and humbling. How much have we simply not looked for, or been unable to look at? What does the archaeology we have privilege over the archaeology we have not tried? The blind spots are as instructive as any theory. We'll go looking for them next, with the same care we brought into the quiet rooms of the stone. Archaeology is a lantern with a small flame. It throws just enough light to make us confident and leaves most of the room in shadow. We walk across Egypt assuming the parts we can see are representative, that if a thing mattered it would be cleared, catalogued, protected. But even on the most photographed plateau on Earth there are blank squares on every plan, zones where the sands sit like a closed book because time, money, politics, or pure bad luck have kept the page from being turned. We mistake the map for the territory. The ground does not share our illusion. Start at Giza and don't look at the pyramids, look at the margins. Fences hug neat rectangles, but wind does not care about straight lines. Outside the tourist paths, dunes creep and retreat, swallowing low walls in a single season and exposing them a year later in a pattern that makes excavation feel like bailing out a boat with a spoon. Within the official zones, triage reigns: dig where funding allows, conserve what is most at risk, postpone what can wait. There are mastaba fields partly cleared, shafts that were recorded a century ago and then reburied for their own safety, corners marked, promising, in notebooks that sit in storerooms humid enough to turn paper to lace. Even at Giza, especially at Giza, the honest sentence is this: we are still looking. Blindness is not just about sand, it is about cities. Ancient Memphis sprawls beneath villages, farmland, and Cairo's modern reach. To peel it open would require tearing up neighborhoods and livelihoods, a violence archaeology doesn't have the right to do. The Nile Delta is worse, not in history but in logistics. Modern settlements ride its old levees like beads on a string. Under the courtyards and paved lanes are layers of habit, mud brick house upon mud brick house, shards packed into fill, foundations cannibalized from earlier walls. Every new pipe trench cuts through a cross-section of ages, and most are closed and tiled before anyone with a trowel gets there. When we say, no monuments earlier than X have been found here, a plumber somewhere could answer, I saw a wall last month, and he might be telling the truth. Elsewhere the ground is guarded by other hands. Military zones fence off tracts of desert that were once easy to survey. Borderlands make logistics impossible for seasons at a time. Permits lapse, projects wait, a political breeze shifts and an entire season is lost. Even when access is generous, the earth plays another trick: water. Rising groundwater in the valley softens mud brick into porridge, salts bloom and crystallize in fine stone until faces flake and inscriptions turn to lace. Archaeologists have watched subterranean passages flood in a single bad year, then stayed away because entering would mean destroying what you meant to save. If technology narrows the blind spots, it does so unevenly. Satellite imagery writes faint rectangles into view, geometries under the plow, lines where a buried wall forces barley to grow thinner. Ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry sketch invisible rooms and streets like X-rays of a patient who will not hold still. These methods are not magic, they are mood rings. Bedrock masquerades as architecture, old channels look like walls, the same signature can mean building or natural layering depending on the season and the water table. Still, every year the tools get a little better. The point is not that we see nothing, it is that we see more suggestively than conclusively, and that suggestion must then wrestle with budgets and permissions and the stubborn physics of moving sand. The bias that matters most is quiet and respectable, we dig where stories are already loud. The Valley of the Kings earns attention whenever a new tomb number can be painted on a door, Luxor rewards the brush with colonnades that clean up beautifully. Giza is irresistible because its silhouettes pay the bills for a museum's outreach and a television crew's promise of wonder. Meanwhile, smaller sites wait. A low mound beside a canal with a scatter of sherds and a line of darker soil, no one writes a grant for that compared to a pyramid. But the staircase to a monumental age often starts with such modest steps. If all we clear are the spectacular chapters, it will always look as though the book begins mid-sentence. Every once in a while the ground rebukes our priorities. In the 1950s, not 10 paces from the Great Pyramid, an intact cedar ship slept in a stone-lined pit, its planks numbered by ancient hands as if they expected to reassemble it after a short journey. It took modern carpenters years to stitch the hull back into its original curve. The ship had been invisible under sand and limestone for nearly 5 millennia while tourists and scholars walked by. If a full-sized vessel can hide at the foot of the most scrutinized monument on Earth, what confidence should we have in our wider conclusions about absence? The blind spot widens when you leave the desert for the river's mouth. The delta is an eraser with a long memory. Silt buries, subsidence tilts, storms rearrange. Under its modern shelf, sonar finds the footprints of vanished channels, divers brush silt from fallen walls and drowned harbors where steels once stood dry in the sun. The fact that we have found late cities, ports from eras with better luck, should encourage humility about earlier layers we have not yet learned to see. The cost of looking is high, the water is opaque, the shelf is littered with modern metal that confuses instruments. No evidence here often translates to no comprehensive search. Blindness has a human side, too. Antiquities were a market for a long time, things were taken from contexts we will never reconstruct. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, bones were often discarded, notes were scant, and the unglamorous finds, the fires, the food, the trash, went uncollected. Even the best digs have shadows in their records, a trench log written by candlelight, a grid slightly misaligned, a box of pottery that changes numbers when a grant changes hands. Archives, where they exist, are their own deserts, miles of paper dunes with labels written in fading ink. There is another kind of blind spot we make on purpose, and we seldom admit it. Archaeology, like any human endeavor, lives inside institutions. Careers lean toward what can be published, what will be funded, what will not embarrass anyone with power. Findings that harmonize with a strong narrative sing louder, discordant notes are sometimes filed until a cultural shift makes them sound less jarring. Controversial is the label that buys time for the nervous and costs time for the curious. Good scholars refuse that pressure as best they can, the rest of us should grant them the patience to work without rushing them into an op-ed. All these shadows are not an invitation to fill the dark with fantasies. They are an invitation to proportion. When we ask whether inheritance touched Giza, whether earlier mass or alignment informed later precision, we should remember that our lens is narrow and our sample skewed toward survivors. It is possible to be cautious without being incurious, to admit that loose ends exist without tying them into a bow. The plateau's palimpsest quality, patched paws, mixed seams, reused blocks, reads differently when you imagine how much of the staircase below the landing might still be under sand or sea. There are bright spots in this dimness, moments when the archive strikes back. Bundles of papyri found in a cave by the Red Sea speak in the voices of boatmen and overseers who lived under Khufu, tallying deliveries, and watched shifts as casually as if eternity were an accounting problem. A workman's village at the edge of the plateau gives us bread ovens and fish bones, the logistics of human life one alley at a time. These finds do not close the case, they improve the questions. They remind us that the people who made the stone stand also queued for rations and argued about roofs and counted days like we do. So let us hold our lanterns honestly. When the wind comes up and the sand moves like a thought across the ground, try to picture what you cannot see: a low wall here, a ramp's bite there, a courtyard buried under a neighborhood, a port asleep in green water. Imagine how a single season of luck could change a chapter's tone. Then widen the lens beyond Egypt for a moment. Across the world there are other places where stone's ambition outlived its blueprints and left us wondering whether the urge to align and endure follows similar lines in distant hands. We will go there next, not to prove a conspiracy of builders, but to learn how parallel answers can teach us what is universal in human stubbornness and what is local to the Nile. For now, remember that our neat chronology stands on islands of evidence. The rest is still shoreless night. Step off the plateau for a moment and let your eyes adjust to distance. When you pull the camera back far enough, certain shapes begin to rhyme across the map. It is not that Giza has twins, nothing truly does, but that other hands, in other places, answered some of the same questions with stone and left answers sturdy enough to reach us. The rhymes are imperfect, and that is the point. Parallel solutions do not need a single author, they need only the same stubborn materials, the same appetite for alignment, and the same human conviction that weight, set just so, can talk to sky in time. In the high basin of Bolivia, at Puma Punku near Tiwanaku, blocks of andesite and sandstone lie as if a careful child took apart a toy to admire its joints. Edges that still slice the air, 90 degrees corners crisp enough to throw thin shadows, grooves that look like the rails of ideas, H-shaped stones with rebates, channels, and right-angled cutouts that may once have locked neighbors into a precision lost in the tumble. Some masses there weigh well over what a truck would grumble to carry. The questions they ask are familiar. How did hands with stone tools discipline an unforgiving rock into such straight talk? How do you move and set a slab that answers to gravity with a shrug? Local answers exist: pounding, abrasion, patient measurement, levers, ramps, but the site's present ruin keeps its original grammar partly illegible. You hear an echo of Giza here, not because the two are kin, but because uncompromising stone makes similar demands on anyone who courts it. Cross to Lebanon and climb the terrace at Baalbek. The Roman temple that crowns it declares its era, the platform below it defies easy assignment. 3 great blocks, each the size of a small house, the trilithon, sit aligned like a phrase whose meaning is confidence. Nearby, in the quarry, rests the stone of the pregnant woman, then beyond it even larger siblings uncovered in recent years, monoliths so big that the imagination blinks. The Roman project absorbed these lower courses, whether or not they inherited them. This is a pattern that Giza teaches us to expect without having to claim the whole as single-authored. Later empires trim and adopt earlier mass because sound foundations are older than any theology. What matters here is the shared stubbornness. If a block will not come in pieces, someone, Roman or before, sometimes decides to make the piece the whole. Turn underwater to an argument carved in basalt. Off Yonaguni in Japan's Ryukyu Islands, stepped forms dive into green, terraces like stairs too wide for feet, right-angled risers, planes broken like sunken ziggurats. Geologists argue they are natural, the result of jointing and erosion. Divers and a handful of researchers see tool-like regularity and plausible additions. The sea, unhelpful as ever, blurs edges and complicates measurements. Whether human or geological, the lesson still serves our broader story. Where stone strata fracture in plates, the eye invents architecture. Where people live near such stone, sometimes they complete what geology began. The line between nature's geometry and cultures is thinner than we like to think, especially after a few millennia of surf. Sail east across the Pacific to Nan Madol in Micronesia, a city folded into a lagoon and stitched together from a forest of prismatic basalt columns. Builders quarried columnar joints, ready-made stone logs, floated or rafted them, and stacked them into walls that still shrug off waves. Canals thread the islets like aisles in a temple. No metal, no cranes, only craft, leverage, and a sea understood as highway rather than barrier. If you want a model for how heavy things go far without wheels, watch islanders who treat water as the original road. It is not Giza, it does not need to be. It proves again that engineering is older than bureaucracy, and that people solve problems with what the land offers when a problem captures a culture's longing. Now to chalk and sarsen. At Stonehenge, lintels still ride pillars with mortise and tenon joints clean enough to read after thousands of winters. The circle's opening speaks solstice, the avenue answers a river's course, the whole is a device that tells time loudly twice a year and whispers it nightly in a vocabulary of stars. In Malta, at Najdra and Hagarkim, doorways frame equinox dawns with a precision that makes sunlight behave like a visitor. These sites do not ask for a genealogy out of Egypt, they ask for respect for convergent attention. If you watch the sky long enough and love it enough to mark it in stone, certain answers repeat because they are good. The temptation, once the rhymes start, is to write a chorus too neat, a single, vanished culture scattering seed knowledge across oceans, a prehistoric academy that taught the password for true north. It is a pleasing story and a dangerous one, because it can flatten difference and steal credit from local genius. There is another way to hear the music. Start with common constraints, hard stone that resists and remembers, bodies that can carry, lever, and float, seasons that rise and fall, stars that return, water that grants and denies. Add the human urge to fix meaning where it can be revisited by descendants. Under those conditions, it would be stranger if builders did not converge on alignments, true planes, large blocks, and ritual axes. Odd fact, megalithic sites far apart often share a simple trick for finding north that needs no magnet, equal altitude observations of a circumpolar star's rise and set, bisected. A shepherd with patience can find a meridian fit for a king. Odd fact, columnar basalt breaks itself into logs, Roman concrete sets underwater, coral limestone cuts like cheese and hardens with air. Technology is as much about geology as it is about genius. Where the echo becomes more than comfort is in the motives people assign their stones. Across cultures, big mass serves as both theater and tool, it stages processions and focuses attention, it catches light at meaningful moments, it provides a stage where the living talk to the dead or the divine. That double role, symbol and instrument, feels nearly universal. At Giza, the shafts that lean toward stars, the gallery that behaves like a horn, the precision of cardinal faces, these are local expressions of a global habit. At Stonehenge, the trilithons knit heaven to season. At Nan Madol, the canals make water part of ceremony. At Baalbek, a platform size declares the platform itself sacred long before any column rises. Wherever you go, stone does more than stand, it performs. Let caution police the next steps. Similar results do not prove shared instruction. Absence of evidence for connection is not evidence against every form of contact. Small boats went farther than we like to grant. Knowledge moves with traders and brides, with captives and refugees. A method can leap geographies without needing a master plan. But if you demand a grand diffusion to explain every straight joint, you do violence to human variation. The safer marvel is this: give people time, sky, stubborn rock, and each other, and they will reinvent excellence often enough to make coincidence look like conspiracy. All of which loops us back to Giza with a gentler confidence. The plateau belongs to a world where many hands learn to speak stone, it need not borrow credibility from a global club to be profound. Yet the club's existence, those other stubborn places, helps us think about what is universal in the urge, permanence against climate's fickleness, a calendar you can walk inside, a claim to place that outlasts named rulers, a technology of awe. Whether you stand in Wiltshire wind, in Andean sun, on a Lebanese terrace, or under Egypt's blue, the sensation is the same: geometry has been made to matter. There is one more rhyme these sites share that we cannot ignore: they all end. Sometimes abruptly, sometimes by soft unraveling, sometimes by a change in what a people wants from stone. Climatic whiplash, salt in the ground, a river that goes elsewhere, a god who stops rewarding a rite, any of these can close a chapter that looked eternal from the inside. We have already watched the Sahara green and go gold, we have already followed the sea into drowned courtyards. Before we return to the plateau, we owe the hardest question a hearing: harder even than who aligned what to which star. If there were earlier hands at Giza, where are their bones? Where are their small things, the trash and the tenderness, that survive almost everywhere humans pause? The next step is into that silence, not because we can fill it all the way, but because the size of the gap determines how brave our speculations are allowed to be. Pick up a skull in your imagination and it turns to powder. That is the first truth the plateau asks you to accept about its earliest ghosts: bone is fragile. Stone is stubborn. A culture that speaks in limestone will outlast a culture that speaks in flesh even when they are the same people. So when we ask, honestly, where the earliest builders are, where their graves lie, their children's teeth, their old men's healed fractures, we are asking why the human archive failed where the stone archive thrived. It is not a small question. It is the size of a silence. Begin with the Nile itself. A floodplain is a brilliant engine for life and a terrible library for the dead. Waterlogged ground dissolves bone to paste, burials sink and tilt, the river changes its course and eats cemeteries without ceremony. In the delta, rising groundwater and subsidence make a sponge of the earth. In Upper Egypt, the modern irrigation regime raises the water table inch by inch until mud brick melts and older graves bloom salts and flake away. Add 5 or 6,000 years and the math is impolite. Unless protected by extraordinary aridity or deliberate mummification, skeletons do not keep their appointments with us. Then add the desert's other trick. We think of sand as preservative because of mummies found intact in hyperarid pockets, and sometimes it is. But dunes also abrade and unroof. A shallow grave that escapes floods may, in a century of wind, become a scatter of eroded bone on the surface, then nothing at all. The Atacama will hold a body like a jar holds grain, the Sahara will hold it like a sieve. Preservation is a lottery and the climate buys most of the tickets. Even if some bones beat the elements, people are not always kind to their dead in ways archaeologists prefer. Funerary habits are not constant across time. Some cultures burn, ash does not leave you a jaw to measure. Some place bones on platforms for birds and sun to clean, the sky burial principle in 100 variants, which leaves little to bury later. Some recycle burial grounds generation after generation until earlier interments are displaced, mixed, and lost. If the Nile's earliest stoneworkers preferred impermanent rites, the material signature would be modest: a stain in soil, a few beads, a shard of a vessel, a ghost of a pit no one would notice unless they were looking through a lens of patience and luck. This is where our own history leans in with mischief. The first generations of diggers in Egypt were not gentle with context. Bones without gold went in spoil heaps, potsherds without painted figures went uncollected, notes were sketchy or lost, a market for antiquities encouraged tunneling rather than recording. Even honest work suffered from the tools of its time: ink that fades, maps that skew, labels that wander from box to box. There are sites where 19th century workers pulled human remains out by the cartload and left us nothing but a rumor of where they lay. The result is a kind of engineered amnesia. Some of the dead we seek were handled and discarded by our predecessors so efficiently that the loss looks natural. Add politics. Villages sit atop ancient ground. Permits fail. A pipeline trench cuts a line through a cemetery and is filled before a scholar hears the rumor. Military zones fence off a patch of desert that happens to hold a low mound with a scatter of flints. The archive is not just fragile, it is contested. Even when we find bone enough to study, Egypt is cruel to DNA. Heat and humidity beat genetic material to confetti. A handful of sets from desert tombs, carefully sheltered, unusually lucky, have yielded sequences, most will not. Without good DNA, population stories blur into morphologies and measurements that can argue many directions if you want them to. You can say, continuity, or turnover, or mixing, and the data, thin and worn, will nod politely to each. There are workarounds. Teeth preserve microscopic records of childhood diet, disease, and movement. Isotopes in enamel can whisper where a person drank water as a child. Microwear traces the grit in someone's meals. A handful of such studies, from later cemeteries we can date and trust, draw lines between desert, delta, and river valley lives. But none of this is a trumpet blast from the deep past. It is an oboe playing from a nearby room. The honest answer to, "Where are their dead?" is not one answer. It is a handful of reasonable paths to disappearance. Picture a community that gathered seasonally to cut and dress stone on high ground, then dispersed with the year to camps and small villages along the river. Their dead would be buried where they lived, not where they worked, low, wet places that erase. Picture a century of climate trouble, the younger dry as chill or the later drying that throttled the green Sahara, and a migration toward the Nile that unties the ribbon of a cemetery and scatters it to a dozen new banks. Picture later kings expanding a necropolis at the edge of the plateau, cutting through older, poorer graves without reverence or notice because their stone agenda had no space for those who left no names. Picture the centuries of lime kilns that ate inscriptionless blocks for mortar and the habit of quarrying old cemeteries for slab and fill. The chain of custody from, "they lived," to, "we can point to them," is full of hands that let go. There is also the quiet possibility that the early hands at Giza were fewer than our romance permits. A small core of specialists can generate an outsized signature in stone, given enough seasons and enough help at the right times. Their genetic and skeletal footprint could drown in the larger demographic flows of the valley, becoming a spice in a stew you cannot identify when it is done. If their burials were ordinary and their living places ephemeral, the odds are not with us. Does that mean we should abandon the search? No, only that we should calibrate our hope to the scale of the problem. The edges of the plateau still hold shallow pits that reveal themselves after storms. The desert east and west of the river sometimes exhales an old shrine or hearth after a sand shift. The delta's underwater shelves, mapped now with more patience, show channel edges where a cemetery could have slept under silt. Some future trench cut by a villager for a new wall may slice through a grave and the right person may hear. Our best work will come not from a single, lost necropolis, shining up at us like a coin, but from 100 small, careful recoveries that add up to a map of habits, where early people put their dead and what they did to them first. There is a lesson we can keep even if the bones do not come: silence is data. It tells you where not to look and why, it tells you what climates do to memory, it tells you that any claim to know the whole story of a place like Giza is arrogant by design. The emptiness around the earliest chapters is not a verdict that nothing happened, it is a margin where our handwriting has not reached the edge of the page. If the plateau's preface remains mostly unwritten in bone, it does not make the later chapters less true. It makes them heavier. The Old Kingdom built tombs that bargained with time, in part because time had already won against so much else. "Make me last," says the stone on behalf of a culture that knew exactly how much the desert and the river take. In that plea is the echo of those who came before, whether you seat them 5 centuries back or 5 millennia, hands that raised something on high ground for reasons we can only name softly, then left without names of their own. We will go on without them in the record, because that is how records work. We will follow the thread they left in things they could not help shaping, alignments, bedrock choices, joints that teach later generations to expect better of themselves. And in the next turn we will listen for a different voice that sometimes survives when bodies do not, language. Not lines on papyrus, but fossil words, place names that refuse new grammars, hints in the oldest Egyptian inscriptions that there was another tongue under the one we can read. If the bones have gone to dust, perhaps a syllable or two still clings to the stone. Language vanishes faster than stone. It has to. It lives in mouths, not quarries. It changes clothes every generation and slips, politely, out of funerals with the people who spoke it best. If an older Nile culture carved its intentions into the plateau before pharaohs learned to carve their names, its voice would not be a text, it would be a ghost, a few stubborn place names that refuse new grammars, a handful of words inside Egyptian that look like houseguests no one can introduce, myths that feel like translations of something no one remembers making. Egyptian itself, when it finally steps onto stone in a way we can read, is already elegant, part of the Afroasiatic family, sharing bones with Berber and Semitic and Chadic tongues. It arrives with consonantal roots and a taste for derivation that suggests long practice offstage. Coptic, the Christian last form of Egyptian written with Greek letters, preserves vowels that hieroglyphs did not, and in those vowels you can hear the river's later music. But beneath the line where writing begins are hints of another melody, a substrate, archaic terms that do not shake hands neatly with relatives, place names that do not parse through known rules, ritual words that feel older than the theology that now wears them. Toponyms are good at surviving conquest. They stick to land like burrs to cloth. Empires change, new letters garnish street corners, the names endure because they are useful. Along the Nile, some modern names trace neat lines back through Coptic to Pharaonic ancestors, their meanings transparent. An island named for elephants because ivory once moved through it, a town that calls itself the Gold Place because the desert fed it ore. Others murmur in accents we cannot place. A handful of bends and banks keep syllables that do not resolve comfortably into Egyptian, Greek, or Arabic. You can stand by a canal and say them and feel, without proof, that you are repeating someone else's compass. There is a smaller, stranger class of words in ancient texts that resist etymology. They name plants that no longer grow where they are listed, winds that no longer behave the way the word implies, tools whose shape you can infer only by reading the job they were told to do. They may be borrowings from neighbors we have not yet properly met, they may be fossils of an older tongue that merged with Egyptian as the river's valley filled. The absence of a perfect family tree does not prove antiquity, but it does open a window. Languages remember by accident where writing refuses to help. Myth, too, can carry a grammar under its poetry. In Egypt, a notion called Zep Tepi, the first time, speaks of an era when gods established order in a world that had emerged wet and undisciplined from primeval water. The god Thoth is praised as the one who measured the heavens and gave mankind the signs. Sometimes he is described as the scribe of the gods, which is a way of saying that writing was a gift rather than an invention. Take none of this literally. Take all of it seriously. A story that places writing in the hands of a deity and then returns it to humans may be the religious memory of an older practice recomposed under a newer theology, someone else's mnemonic recast as divine law. On cliff faces in eastern and western deserts, petroglyphs show boats and animals and stylized humans cut by hands that did not leave a key. These are not writing, but they are not mere decoration either. They are a symbolic habit, a way of stabilizing meaning in rock long enough for someone else to find it. In the pre-dynastic graves of Abydos, tags attached to goods bear incised emblems, animals, standards, that look suspiciously like signs on their way toward becoming script. Later, those signs become lists, and lists become sentences. The finished system presents itself suddenly in the record because papyrus rots and wood burns and the early drafts were scratched where the climate could not keep them. We call that suddenness, the past would call it the moment the permanent surface was ready. If a different language moved under Nile speech before hieroglyphs cut their first shadow, it would leave traces in the way New Egyptian handled old places. Some names are generic, the pillar town, the island in midstream, the fortress on high ground, and later speakers translate and overwrite them without noticing. Others are specific sounds that refuse translation. A priest in a later century will stand in a temple court and pronounce one of those uncooperative names as a charm rather than a label because he has inherited its power without understanding its grammar. The word ceases to be a word. It becomes a ritual fossil, polished by mouths. Language does not just drift, it traffics. Traders press words into each other's baskets with the same indifference that they press dates and copper. Stoneworkers borrow tool names as easily as masons borrow tricks. A community coaxing platforms from the desert's edge might have carried a short glossary the way a carpenter carries a bag, terms for sledges and cord twists and the exact noun for the kind of wet fine grit that makes a sledge sing. If that community later merged into the river's larger speech, those terms could survive, narrow, technical, unglamorous, long after the story that birthed them had gone to dust. And if the older speakers moved on, or faded, or were absorbed in the long compression toward the Nile that the drying Sahara taught people to perform, then their words would end up like small stones in bread, occasionally caught in a later bite, noticed only when a tongue complains. Linguists have tried to catalog such grit inside Egyptian, to separate the built-in from the borrowed, and the work never quite ends because to decide a word's parentage is to make a bet on vanished conversations. The best we can say is that some of what we read as Egyptian has unfamiliar fingerprints on it, fingerprints smudged by time past legibility. There is a parallel route to hearing the unsaid, and it lies in rhythm. Meter and formula are memory's tools. If a culture lives by oral law and teaches with the sky, its sentences will be shaped for remembering, repeated openings, mirrored closings, number patterns that fold meaning into countable packages. Fragments of such cadence sometimes survive in later hymns and liturgies, embedded in lines that no longer scan perfectly because the language shifted while the ritual stayed. A stratigraphy of sound tells you what the stone refuses to explain. A chorus that feels older than its theology probably is. All of this is the softest evidence, and it demands a soft hand. It does not date a platform, it does not assign authorship to a block. It works the way fossils work in limestone, you see a shape and infer the sea. Even when the currents are too shallow to name a fish, you can say, water stood here. Hearing the older language inside Egyptian is like that, a wetness in the grammar, a refracted glint in a ritual verb, a toponym that tastes of a lake that is no longer there. The caution to carry is fairness. It is easy to turn every unsolved etymology into an ancestor and every mysterious place name into a lost city. Resist that. It is enough to admit that Egyptian did not grow in a vacuum, that the Nile's world was crowded with tongues, and that the speech we can finally read is proud of what it absorbed. If the plateau's earliest hands spoke differently, the river's language did what rivers do, it gathered what entered, carried it forward, and laid it down in layers where it slowed. There is one more kind of word that survives longest, and it is not carved. It is the word for, here. People teach their children a pointing vocabulary long before they teach them a grammar. If you stand on high ground and say, this, enough times across enough centuries, even after the words change you will still be pointing at the same place. You can hear that gesture in Egypt's oldest sacred lists, a tendency to sanctify specific coordinates with names that persist through invasions and reforms. A plateau, a bend, a hill that looks east, language coats them and wears away, the pointing does not. Giza, in that sense, is a sentence that never stopped being said. The words we recognize are late. The act of naming the place, of making, here, a sacred instrument, may be older than any grammar recorded. If the bones have fallen to powder, perhaps this is the voice that remains to speak for them, a river language that swallowed an older dialect whole and still, in certain syllables and stubborn place names, betrays what it ate. That is the most we can ask of languages that died before inks were mixed, that they left a taste behind. From there, we return to what stone can tell without anyone's help, the way blocks record exposure and repair, the way joints reveal logistics, the way monuments learn to wear generations like skins. We have followed whispers through grammar. Now we will listen for the last loud arguments the materials can still make on their own, and then, because every story must cut tonight, we will sit with the possibility of endings, how a culture that could do this could also stop. The wind at Giza remembers what we forget. After sunset it changes temperament, less grit in its teeth, more caution in its touch, as if even air shows deference when it moves among geometry that treats centuries like minutes. The city's glow hangs low on the horizon, a modern mirage. Up here, the plateau keeps its own weather. Heat unfastens itself from the stone one thread at a time. Sound goes thin. You can hear your steps argue softly with dust that has rehearsed this conversation since before names learned to last. If the pyramids were born entirely in the 4th dynasty, they have already outlived the ambition that set them rising. If part of their mass belongs to an earlier hand, if some course or platform or quarry line carried forward from a wetter age, the endurance is stranger still. Either way, the stones have done what no ledger can, they have stayed. They have kept a place fixed long enough for climates to pivot, languages to molt, and kingship itself to be replaced by other flavors of certainty. It is not that the pyramids solve the past. It is that they keep the questions from blowing away. Stand between block and night and count the tutors that brought us here. Climate speaks first, ice retreating, seas climbing stairs in jerks, a Sahara blooming and then tightening into its modern severity. Water plays mason and editor by turns, drowning lowlands, saving what stands high, writing rain on rock in a script that stones read better than we do. Geology answers next, shells pressed into limestone, beds strong and beds that unbutton under a thumb, granite teased from Aswan and made to accept edges. Craft follows, patient, obstinate, unrushed, fingers that learned how to turn abrasives and copper into joints that still shame our short attention spans. Then myth, language, the bureaucrat's list, the priest's chant, each laying down a layer of meaning over the same mass until the monument becomes a palimpsest of uses. Finally, the part we hate to admit, accident and loss. Floods that archive, dunes that delete, politics that steer trowels elsewhere. Much of what we call mystery is the residue of erasure. You can feel all of that at once if you let the dark do its work. Orion lifts over the western desert, familiar and rearranged, a hunter whose belt no generation has ever seen in quite the same place. North is not where it used to be in the old skybooks, precession, slow and unrude, asking builders to accept that any alignment is only a truce with motion. The pyramid faces stay true enough to insult our compasses anyway. The narrow hidden shafts tilt toward their old targets with an accuracy that is either ritual or instrument or, more likely, both. Somewhere above the Grand Gallery, the long silent void that the muons found is doing exactly what it was cut to do, lightening a load, balancing a behavior, holding a space where stone needed a breath. None of this requires wireless power or secret engines. All of it requires respect for how a culture can make architecture behave like a tool, and how a tool, used long enough, becomes a liturgy. The night also makes room for humility. Names matter, Khufu in a hurried red hand where only builders would have written, gang marks that read like progress notes. Logistics matter, quarries that bite into the plateau like parentheses, boat pits that slept a few paces from wonder because sand keeps secrets well. Papyri matter, the dull glory of delivery rosters, men on watch, bread and beer accounted for at a rate no myth could sustain. When evidence speaks plainly, you listen. But you also keep an ear for the ways that stone refuses to vote. A seam that betrays a repair. A face that was recut when the climate dried its patience. A corner where an older weather skin peeks through a newer polish. These are the marginalia that do not fit inside any single author's cartouche. It is a good place to consider the stories people told to protect standards they feared they might not keep. Followers of Horus. God kings. Giants. Not because someone found a femur twice the length of yours, but because a granite plane that takes a lifetime to love into exactness deserves a name bigger than an artisan can write. Myths are not blueprints, they are guardians. They make the line of hands feel continuous even when the tricks of the trade grow thin. They license reuse without shame. If your platform inherits a sanctity older than you, then to rebuild it is to participate, not to steal. We can keep the poetry without surrendering to credulity. We can let it tell us how people chose to behave around work that outlived them. What, then, are we left with at the end of this long walk? A set of possibilities narrowed by respect. The Sphinx's enclosure may record reign older than dynasties, or a cocktail of wind, salt, and repair that mimics that signature. The plateau may carry forward lines begun under greener skies, or it may be an old kingdom invention that learned quickly from the land's geology and the sky's clock. The Grand Gallery's horn, the King's Chamber's stubborn note, the cardinal faces that barely miss, these can be read as the fingerprints of a ritual architecture tuned by practice rather than equations. The delta's drowned shelves warn us that lowland prologues rot in brine, the deserts remind us that drafts in perishable media die on schedule. The absence of bones is a climate story more than a conspiracy. The stray syllables in place names hint at older tongues without obliging us to write epics about them. The truth, as the plateau keeps teaching, is layered enough to feed wonder honestly. So allow yourself one last image before you go, a night near the end of a green century when the first builders, whoever they were, stood on this ledge with hands that smelled of wet stone and counted out a rhythm to keep a haul crew steady. The river below was broader, the air tasted like plants, stars cut clean lines across a sky not yet scarred by cities. Their reasons were likely practical and ceremonial at once: mark a moment, hold a place against water, say something in stone that would still be here when words wore out. Then let the scene jump ages forward to a season in Khufu's time when scribes inked rations for quarrymen and foremen scrawled gang names in red because pride is older than paper. Then let the scene jump again to the present, you, shoes crunching in dust, reading a monument with eyes trained by other monuments, carrying home a pocket's worth of white grit that used to be an ocean. If you want certainty, the plateau is a poor host. It offers, instead, a discipline: look closely, accept erosion, test your good ideas against the stone's bad mood, trust what the materials admit, keep a drawer labeled pending, hold room for wonder that does not need rescue by fantasy. It is possible to love the pyramids without pretending they are machines or messages from a lost perfection. It is also possible to love them without flattening them into tombs and nothing else. They are more interesting than either comfort allows. They are places where a climate argument meets a quarry problem meets a theology meets a shift change. They are proof that human beings, given time and sky and a vocabulary of stone, will attempt something that insults oblivion. The wind slackens a little more. The temperature drops the last degree it owes you. Somewhere, a dog in the village below decides to answer nothing in particular. You think of the archivists this place deserves, divers over drowned shelves, surveyors reading ghost rivers on satellite maps, quarrymen's descendants who still know by ear when limestone is about to give. You think of what we will never find and how often the never is our own fault. You let the not knowing be large enough to share the view with you without pushing you off the ledge. And then you do the simplest, oldest thing. You look up. Orion is where it is for now. North is where it is for now. You are where you are for now. The stones have been here longer than anyone who named them, and they will still be here when your name is a small sound a stranger cannot pronounce. You say thank you without needing to decide who should hear it. You start back down the path. Behind you the triangles darken into sky. Ahead of you the city is a spill of fire. Between the two is the kind of night that lets a mind keep two clocks running at once and not go mad. Good night.